The weathered coastline of Northumbria presented an aspect of deceptive tranquility on the morning of June 8, 793, as the monastic community on Lindisfarne pursued their customary devotions within the stone walls of a sanctuary that had stood as a beacon of Christian learning and spiritual authority for more than a century. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Phone face down, volume at a whisper. Let's dive in. The monastery of Lindisfarne, established by the Irish monk Aidan in 634 at the invitation of King Oswald of Northumbria, had developed over the subsequent century and a half into one of the most significant religious and cultural centres in early medieval Britain. The island's position, accessible from the mainland only during low tide across a causeway that disappeared beneath the North Sea during high water, provided both strategic isolation and symbolic separation from secular concerns. The community had produced illuminated manuscripts of exceptional quality, including the Lindisfarne Gospels created around 715, which represented the pinnacle of insular art, combining Celtic, Anglo-Saxon, and Mediterranean influences in visual forms of extraordinary sophistication. The monastery's library contained texts collected from across the Christian world, while its scriptorium trained scribes whose skills were sought by ecclesiastical institutions throughout Britain and beyond. The relics of St. Cuthbert, who had served as Bishop of Lindisfarne from 685 until his death in 687, drew pilgrims from across northern England and Scotland, creating networks of religious devotion that connected the island monastery to the broader spiritual geography of early medieval Christendom. The Viking assault on Lindisfarne emerged from maritime approaches that the monastic community had no capacity to defend against or even adequately detect before the attackers reached the shore. The longships that carried the raiders across the North Sea represented technological achievements that enabled Scandinavian warriors to conduct surprise attacks on coastal targets with unprecedented effectiveness. These vessels, constructed using clinker building techniques that overlapped oak planks and fastened them with iron rivets, combined shallow drafts that permitted navigation in coastal waters and up rivers with seaworthiness that allowed extended ocean voyages. The ship's symmetrical designs, with identical bow and stern configurations, eliminated the need for turning in restricted waters, enabling raiders to reverse direction instantly when departing from attack sites. The flexibility of the hull construction absorbed wave impacts that would have shattered more rigid vessels, while the single square sail provided propulsion during favorable wind conditions and could be quickly lowered when oars offered superior control. The typical raiding vessel measured approximately 70 to 80 feet in length, with a beam of 17 to 18 feet, capable of carrying crews of 30 to 40 warriors, along with their weapons, provisions, and eventually plunder. The minimal draft, often less than 3 feet when loaded, permitted these ships to approach directly onto beaches, rather than requiring harbour facilities or anchorage in deeper water. The warriors who descended upon Lindisfarne that June morning came from regions that would later be identified as Norway, though the political geography of 8th century Scandinavia remained fragmented among competing chieftains and regional powers that had not yet coalesced into the unified kingdoms that would emerge during subsequent centuries. The decision to target Christian monasteries reflected calculated strategic thinking rather than random violence, as these religious institutions accumulated portable wealth in forms particularly suitable for Viking economic systems. Monasteries housed liturgical objects crafted from precious metals, including chalices, candlesticks, reliquaries, and altar decorations that could be melted down for their gold and silver content, or traded intact in markets where such items commanded premium prices. Illuminated manuscripts, while valued by monastic communities for their spiritual and scholarly content, held little interest for raiders focused on immediately convertible wealth, leading to the destruction or abandonment of texts that represented irreplaceable cultural achievements. The monastic populations themselves, composed of individuals who had chosen religious vocations and received education that distinguished them from most of their contemporaries, became targets for capture and sale in slave markets that constituted significant components of Viking Age economic systems. The attack's violence shocked contemporaries, whose written accounts preserve the horror and incomprehension that characterized Christian responses to this unprecedented assault on a sacred site. Alcuin of York, the Northumbrian scholar who had become one of Charlemagne's most trusted advisors and architects of the Carolingian Renaissance, wrote multiple letters responding to news of the Lindisfarne raid that reached the Frankish court within weeks of the event. His correspondence, addressed to King Ethelred of Northumbria, Bishop Higbold of Lindisfarne, and various other figures in positions of religious and secular authority, interpreted the attack through theological frameworks that understood historical events as manifestations of divine judgment against human sinfulness. Alcuin's letters enumerated moral failings that he believed had invited God's punishment, including excessive attention to worldly concerns, luxurious dress and behavior, unbefitting religious vocations, and general corruption of spiritual discipline. The impossibility of defending against sea-borne raiders, who could strike without warning from any direction, received less analytical attention than the spiritual conditions that Alcuin believed had permitted such catastrophe to befall a community dedicated to Christian service. His invocation of Old Testament precedents for divine punishment through pagan invaders provided interpretative frameworks that made the Lindisfarne attack comprehensible within existing theological understanding. Even as the event's traumatic impact resonated through subsequent generations of monastic memory, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, compiled more than a century after the Lindisfarne raid, recorded the event alongside portents and omens that contemporary observers interpreted as divine warnings about the impending catastrophe. The Chronicle's entry for 793 described exceptional lightning storms, fiery dragons appearing in the sky, and widespread famine that followed the monastery's destruction, creating narrative connections between natural phenomena and human disasters that reflected early medieval understandings of cosmic order and divine intervention in terrestrial affairs. The Chronicle's retrospective composition, undertaken during the reign of Alfred the Great as part of his cultural and educational reforms, incorporated the Lindisfarne attack into a longer historical narrative that traced Anglo-Saxon kingdoms' development from their legendary origins through centuries of political consolidation and Christianization. The raid's inclusion in this foundational historical text, despite occurring decades before the Chronicle's compilation, indicated the event's enduring significance in Anglo-Saxon historical consciousness and its symbolic function as the inaugural moment of a new and terrible age of violence directed against Christian civilization by pagan forces. The Lindisfarne raid, while shocking in its targeting of a sacred site and its demonstration of Viking military capabilities, represented neither the first Viking attack on British territories nor the beginning of Scandinavian awareness of wealth concentrations in Christian monasteries. Earlier raids on Portland in Dorset during the 790s, recorded in somewhat ambiguous chronicle entries that may actually describe events from 789, had already demonstrated Scandinavian warriors' capacity to strike coastal targets in southern England. These earlier attacks, which resulted in the deaths of local officials who attempted to enforce royal authority over the mysterious visitors, revealed the fundamental incompatibility between existing legal and administrative frameworks and the reality of sea-borne raiders who recognized no obligation to respect local jurisdiction or royal authority. The Portland attacks' limited scale and their occurrence in southern regions, distant from major ecclesiastical centers, meant that they generated less contemporary commentary than the Lindisfarne raid, which struck at one of Northumbria's most significant religious sites and consequently received extensive documentation from shocked observers. The expansion of Viking raiding activity during the decade following the Lindisfarne attack demonstrated that the 793 assault represented the beginning of a sustained pattern of Scandinavian predation on British and Irish targets, rather than an isolated incident. Monasteries in Ireland, Scotland, and various locations along the English coast experienced attacks that followed similar patterns, with seaborne raiders targeting sites accessible from navigable waterways and timing their assaults to achieve complete surprise. The monastery at Jarrow in Northumbria, where the Venerable Bede had spent his life and produced his Historia Ecclesiastica Gentis Anglorum, suffered an attack in 794 that resulted in the death of the abbot and the destruction or theft of the monastery's portable wealth. The raiders' incomplete success at Jarrow, where some attackers were killed and their leader captured and executed, provided slight consolation to communities struggling to comprehend the sudden vulnerability of religious sites that had previously enjoyed security, derived from both their sacred character and their geographical positions in regions remote from traditional military threats. The economic motivations underlying these raids reflected Scandinavian society's social structures and the role of portable wealth in establishing and maintaining status within hierarchical systems dominated by warrior elites. The distribution of raid plunder among ship crews and the obligations of successful raiders to share wealth with followers and dependents created economic incentives that encouraged repeated expeditions to target rich environments. The relative ease of acquiring substantial wealth through monastery raids, compared to the agricultural labor or craft production that sustained most Scandinavian populations, made raiding an attractive option for ambitious young men seeking to establish independent households or enhance their social positions. The prestige associated with successful raiding, independent of the material rewards such expeditions generated, meant that even warriors who already possessed adequate economic resources might participate in raids for the social capital and reputation that martial accomplishments provided. The absence of effective defense mechanisms against seaborne attacks enabled relatively small raiding parties to achieve objectives that would have required substantially larger forces in terrestrial military operations against fortified positions or organized armies. The technological sophistication, represented by Viking longships and their navigation capabilities, enabled raiders to identify and exploit vulnerabilities in the defensive arrangements of coastal territories throughout the British Isles and beyond. Scandinavian seafarers possessed extensive knowledge of maritime conditions, including tidal patterns, seasonal weather variations, and coastal geography that permitted efficient route planning and tactical flexibility during raids. The ability to navigate by observing sun angles, recognizing seabirds' flight patterns, noting water color and wave characteristics, and interpreting various other environmental indicators enabled Viking navigators to maintain course awareness during extended ocean voyages and approach targeted coastlines from directions that minimized detection risks. The practice of coastal raiding, which became increasingly systematic during the late 8th and early 9th centuries, represented the application of seafaring capabilities developed through generations of Scandinavian maritime experience to military and economic objectives that exploited the wealth concentrations and defensive weaknesses of Christian territories. The response capabilities of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms to Viking raids remained severely limited during the initial decades of attacks, as existing military systems had evolved to address threats from neighboring kingdoms rather than seaborne raiders who could strike without warning and withdraw before effective resistance could be organized. The Anglo-Saxon Fyrd, a militia system that obligated free men to perform military service when summoned by royal authority, functioned adequately for territorial defense against invading armies, whose movements could be tracked and whose logistical requirements imposed limitations on strategic mobility. The Fyrd's effectiveness decreased dramatically when confronted with raiders who arrived by sea, struck isolated targets, and departed before defensive forces could concentrate at threatened locations. The absence of naval forces capable of intercepting Viking ships at sea meant that coastal communities and inland sites, accessible via rivers, remained vulnerable to attacks that existing military institutions could neither prevent, effectively counter. The decentralized nature of Anglo-Saxon political authority, with multiple kingdoms pursuing independent policies and frequently engaged in conflicts among themselves, further reduced the capacity for coordinated defensive responses to Viking raiding. The period from approximately 793 through the mid-830s witnessed increasingly frequent Viking raids against targets throughout the British Isles, with attackers demonstrating growing sophistication in selecting vulnerable sites and extracting maximum wealth before defensive forces could respond. The island of Iona, off the western coast of Scotland, site of the monastery founded by St. Columba in 563 and one of Celtic Christianity's most important spiritual centers, suffered repeated attacks in 802, 806, and 825 that resulted in the deaths of numerous monks and the eventual abandonment of the monastery's most exposed locations. The progressive intensification of these attacks, with each successive raid inflicting greater destruction and demonstrating more thorough knowledge of the site's layout and wealth locations, illustrated how Viking raiders accumulated tactical intelligence through repeated operations against the same targets. The movement of St. Columba's relics from Iona to Kells in Ireland during 807 reflected monastic communities' recognition that traditional defensive strategies based on geographical isolation and sacred character provided inadequate protection against raiders who neither respected Christian sanctity nor feared the spiritual consequences of violating holy sites. The expansion of Viking raiding to include targets in Francia and other continental territories demonstrated that attacks on British and Irish monasteries formed part of broader patterns of Scandinavian maritime predation that exploited vulnerabilities throughout Christian Europe. The sack of the monastery at Noirmoutier, near the mouth of the Loire River in the 790s, established Viking presence in regions that would experience increasingly severe raids during subsequent decades. The attack on the trading settlement at Dorestad in the Rhine Delta during 834 marked a shift toward targeting secular commercial centers whose accumulated wealth derived from trade networks rather than religious functions. These continental raids, conducted by Viking forces, whose ethnic and geographical origins remained diverse, and whose organizational structures ranged from independent ship crews to larger fleets operating under coordinated leadership, demonstrated that the maritime capabilities enabling attacks on British targets could be applied equally effectively against continental territories. The Frankish Empire's greater resources and more centralized authority structures eventually enabled more effective defensive responses than Anglo-Saxon kingdoms could mount during this early period, though continental territories continued experiencing devastating Viking raids throughout the 9th century. The evolution of Viking raiding strategies during the 820s and 830s reflected raiders' growing familiarity with British geographical conditions and their increasing willingness to undertake extended campaigns that involved overwintering in targeted territories, rather than returning to Scandinavia between raiding seasons. The establishment of temporary fortified camps on islands that provided defensible positions, while maintaining access to ships, enabled Viking forces to sustain operations throughout winter months and conduct raids against multiple targets from secure bases. The island of Sheppey in the Thames estuary served as a Viking overwintering site in 835, marking the first recorded instance of raiders remaining in English territory through winter, rather than departing after summer raiding seasons. This tactical evolution, which permitted more sustained pressure on targeted regions and reduced the time and risks associated with annual voyages between Scandinavia and raiding territories, signaled a transition from opportunistic coastal raids toward more systematic military campaigns aimed at territorial control rather than simple plunder extraction. The political fragmentation characterizing Anglo-Saxon England during the early 9th century created conditions that hampered effective response to escalating Viking threats, while providing raiders with opportunities to exploit conflicts between competing kingdoms. The four major Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, and Wessex maintained separate political identities and frequently pursued conflicting interests that prevented coordinated defensive efforts. Northumbria, which had dominated northern England during the 7th and 8th centuries and produced the brilliant monastic culture that Vikings now attacked, experienced political instability during the early 9th century as competing factions struggled for control and royal authority declined. Mercia under King Coenwulf, who reigned from 796 to 821, represented the strongest Anglo-Saxon kingdom during this period and maintained hegemony over southern English territories, including East Anglia and various smaller kingdoms. Wessex, which would eventually emerge as the dominant Anglo-Saxon kingdom and provide leadership for resistance against Viking conquest, remained subordinate to Mercian power during the early 9th century and focused primarily on defending its territories against both Mercian ambitions and Viking raids along its southern coastline. The death of King Ecgbert of Wessex in 839, after a reign that had witnessed both West Saxon expansion at Mercian expense and increasing Viking pressure on southern England, marked the beginning of a period when his son Ethelwulf would confront escalating Scandinavian attacks while attempting to maintain the territorial gains that Egbert had achieved. Ethelwulf's reign from 839 to 858 encompassed the final years, when Viking attacks on England retained primarily the character of raids aimed at plunder extraction rather than territorial conquest. The Battle of Aclere in 851, where Ethelwulf led West Saxon forces to victory against a Viking army that had previously captured Canterbury and defeated a Mercian army, demonstrated that Anglo-Saxon military forces could defeat Viking armies in pitched battles when they could force raiders to engage on unfavorable terms. However, the battle's outcome proved exceptional rather than representative, as Viking raiders generally avoided confrontations where they lacked tactical advantages and withdrew when faced with superior forces rather than risking defeat in conventional battles. The intensification of Viking activity during the 850s and early 860s included increasingly ambitious operations that targeted major urban centers and involved larger forces than the ship crews that had characterized earlier raids. The attack on London in 851, by a fleet reportedly numbering 350 ships, represented a qualitative escalation in Viking operations that threatened not merely isolated monasteries or small coastal settlements, but major commercial and administrative centers. The ability to coordinate operations involving dozens of ships and hundreds of warriors indicated organizational capabilities that extended beyond the independent raiding parties that had dominated earlier attacks. The political leadership providing strategic direction for these larger operations remained obscure in contemporary sources, which generally provided little information about Viking political structures or the decision-making processes that shaped raiding strategies. The diversity of Scandinavian ethnic backgrounds among raiders, including both Norwegian and Danish elements, complicated efforts to identify unified command structures or centralized authority directing Viking operations in England. The period between the large-scale attack on London in 851 and the arrival of what Anglo-Saxon sources termed the Great Heathen Army in 865 witnessed continued Viking raiding throughout England, with particular intensity along southern and eastern coastlines where geography favored seaborne attacks. The establishment of semi-permanent bases on offshore islands provided Vikings with secure positions from which to launch operations against mainland targets, while maintaining the option of rapid withdrawal to defensive positions if confronted by superior Anglo-Saxon forces. The island of Thanet in the Thames estuary, which Vikings occupied during 850 to 851 and again during 854 to 855, served as a base for raids throughout Kent and neighbouring regions. These extended occupations, which involved negotiations and payment of tribute by local authorities seeking to prevent raids, established precedents for the systematic extraction of wealth through threatened violence rather than actual attacks, creating early examples of the protection payments that would later be formalized as danegeld. The accession of Alfred to the West Saxon throne in 871, following the deaths of his three elder brothers during the previous 6 years, occurred at a moment when Viking conquest of the eastern Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had created an existential crisis that threatened West Saxon independence and the survival of any independent Anglo-Saxon political authority in England. The context surrounding Alfred's rise to kingship requires understanding of the catastrophic events that had transformed Viking presence in England from episodic raiding to systematic conquest during the 6 years following the Great Heathen Army's arrival in 865. The term Great Heathen Army, preserved in Anglo-Saxon chronicle entries for these years, distinguished this force from earlier Viking raiding parties through both its size and its sustained focus on territorial conquest, rather than plunder extraction. Contemporary sources provided limited, reliable information about the army's composition, leadership, or precise numerical strength, though later Norse sagas attributed leadership to the sons of the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok, seeking to avenge their father's death at the hands of King Ella of Northumbria. The historical reliability of these saga accounts remains questionable, as their composition centuries after the events they purported to describe incorporated legendary elements that cannot be verified through contemporary evidence. The Great Heathen Army's landing in East Anglia during autumn 865 initiated a 6-year campaign that systematically destroyed 3 of the 4 major Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and established Scandinavian people control over approximately half of England. The army's East Anglian landing, rather than representing the campaign's ultimate objective, provided a strategic position from which to launch attacks against more politically significant targets, while extracting supplies and horses from the East Anglian kingdom. The acquisition of horses, which enabled Viking warriors to move rapidly overland, rather than depending entirely on ships for transportation, represented a crucial tactical adaptation that dramatically increased operational range and reduced vulnerability during inland campaigns. The transformation from ship-borne raiders to mounted infantry eliminated many of the geographical constraints that had previously limited Viking operations to coastal areas and navigable rivers, enabling attacks on targets throughout England, regardless of their accessibility from waterways. The army's movement northward from East Anglia during 866, culminating in the capture of York on November 1st, 866, exploited Northumbrian political instability resulting from civil war between rival claimants to the kingdom's throne. The city's fall occurred with such rapidity that the divided Northumbrian factions had insufficient time to organize effective resistance before Viking forces seized control of the former capital of northern England's most important kingdom. The strategic significance of York, positioned at the confluence of the rivers Ouse and Foss and serving as the ecclesiastical centre of northern England through its archbishopric, made its capture a devastating blow to Northumbrian power and a demonstration of Viking military capabilities that shocked contemporary observers. The city's Roman fortifications, which had been maintained and modified during the intervening centuries, provided defensive infrastructure that Vikings adapted for their own purposes, transforming York from a target of conquest into a base for consolidating control over surrounding territories. The Northumbrian response to York's capture, which involved temporary cooperation between the rival factions that had been engaged in civil war, demonstrated the threat's severity that transcended normal political conflicts. The combined Northumbrian army's assault on Viking-occupied York during March 21st, 867, represented the most significant Anglo-Saxon military effort to reclaim territory from Viking occupation during this early phase of the conquest. The battle's outcome, which resulted in decisive Viking victory and the deaths of both rival Northumbrian kings, along with substantial portions of the kingdom's military elite, effectively destroyed Northumbria as an independent political entity. The surviving Northumbrian population, lacking both political leadership and military capability to resist Viking domination, submitted to a puppet king who ruled northern territories under Viking oversight, while the conquerors directly controlled York and its immediate environs. The Viking armies returned to Mercia during 867, and its establishment of winter quarters at Nottingham brought the conquest campaign to England's most powerful kingdom and initiated a confrontation that would determine whether any Anglo-Saxon kingdom could successfully resist the invasion. The Mercian king Burgred's appeal for assistance to his West Saxon allies, formalized through his marriage to King Ethelred of Wessex's sister, led to the deployment of a combined Mercian West Saxon army that besieged Viking forces at Nottingham. The siege's inconclusive outcome, which ended with negotiations rather than military victory for either side, demonstrated both the difficulty of dislodging Vikings from fortified positions and the limitations of Anglo-Saxon military capabilities when confronting opponents who had secured defensible locations and maintained discipline under siege conditions. The Vikings' successful withdrawal from Nottingham to winter quarters in York during 868, achieved without significant losses despite being surrounded by a superior Anglo-Saxon force, illustrated tactical flexibility and military professionalism that distinguished their operations from the more conventional warfare between Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The conquest of East Anglia during 869 to 870 represented the campaign's most brutal phase and established patterns of violence that would characterize Viking treatment of defeated Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The capture and execution of King Edmund of East Anglia, who later became venerated as a martyr saint, occurred under circumstances that remain disputed in historical sources, but clearly involved deliberate killing of a captured king, rather than the ransom or exile that typically followed defeat in warfare between Christian kingdoms. The systematic destruction of East Anglian political structures and the replacement of the kingdom's aristocracy with Scandinavian settlers created conditions in which previous social hierarchies dissolved and new distributions of land and authority emerged. The transformation of East Anglia from an independent kingdom with its own political traditions and cultural identity into a region under direct Viking control prefigured similar processes that would affect other conquered territories. During subsequent years, the Viking army's invasion of Wessex during late 870, following their methodical destruction of the three eastern Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, confronted the last remaining independent Anglo-Saxon kingdom with the choice between submission and resistance against forces that had demonstrated overwhelming military superiority throughout 5 years of campaigning. The army's occupation of Reading in Berkshire, where they constructed fortifications at the junction of the Thames and Kennet rivers, provided a strategic base from which to conduct operations throughout Wessex, while maintaining secure lines of communication with Viking-controlled territories to the east. The location selection demonstrated sophisticated strategic thinking that balanced offensive capabilities with defensive security, as the riverside position enabled resupply by water, while the fortifications provided protection against Anglo-Saxon counterattacks. The West Saxon response, which involved multiple attempts to engage Viking forces in battle during winter months, when military operations typically ceased, reflected the desperate nature of the kingdom's situation and the recognition that permitting Vikings to consolidate their position would make subsequent expulsion increasingly difficult. The Battle of Ashdown, fought on January 8, 871, represented the most significant West Saxon military success against the Great Heathen Army and provided crucial evidence that Viking forces could be defeated in conventional battle when Anglo-Saxon armies could achieve favorable tactical conditions. The battle's location in the Berkshire Downs, where Viking forces occupied high ground and West Saxon attackers advanced uphill against prepared positions, created circumstances that generally favored defenders in early medieval warfare. The division of both armies into multiple contingents, with King Ethelred commanding one West Saxon force and his younger brother Alfred leading another, reflected tactical doctrines that sought to maintain command flexibility and prevent total defeat through concentration of all forces in a single formation. The battle's outcome, which resulted in the death of one Viking king and 5 jarls along with substantial casualties among the raiders' forces, demonstrated that Vikings were not invincible and that their previous successes resulted from tactical advantages and operational flexibility rather than inherent military superiority. The strategic impact of Ashdown proved limited despite its tactical success, as the Viking army maintained its position at Reading and continued operations throughout Wessex during subsequent months. The Battle of Basing on January 22, 871, resulted in Viking victory that offset their earlier defeat at Ashdown, while the Battle of Meriton during March 871 produced inconclusive results that left both sides claiming victory. The attritional character of this winter campaigning, which involved multiple engagements within a few months and inflicted casualties on both sides, placed severe strains on West Saxon military capabilities and demonstrated the challenge of sustaining field armies during extended campaigns against opponents who could withdraw to fortified positions when circumstances turned unfavorable. The death of King Ethelred shortly after the Battle of Meriton, possibly from wounds received in battle, though sources remain ambiguous, transferred royal authority to Alfred at a moment of maximum crisis when Viking forces controlled the majority of England and appeared poised to complete their conquest by subjugating Wessex as they had destroyed the eastern kingdoms. Alfred's accession in April 871 occurred without succession dispute, despite the existence of his deceased brother's young sons, who might have claimed inheritance rights under other circumstances. The military emergency created by the Viking invasion made the selection of an experienced adult commander preferable to adhering to strict hereditary succession principles that might have elevated a minor to the throne during the consent. Kingdom's existential crisis. Alfred's military experience, gained through participation in the previous year's campaigns, including the victory at Ashdown, where he had commanded one of the two West Saxon contingents, provided practical knowledge of Viking military capabilities and tactical methods that would inform his subsequent defensive strategies. His accession occurred at a moment when West Saxon military resources had been severely depleted by months of continuous campaigning, when substantial portions of the kingdom's territory remained under Viking occupation or threat, and when the examples of Northumbria, Mercia, and East Anglia demonstrated the fate awaiting kingdoms that failed to mount effective resistance against the invasion. The military situation during Alfred's early reign deteriorated further as additional Viking forces arrived in England and joined the campaign against Wessex. The landing of what Anglo-Saxon sources termed the Great Summer Army during 871 augmented Viking military strength at precisely the moment when West Saxon capabilities had been reduced by casualties and exhaustion from the previous year's fighting. The combined Viking forces' renewed assault on Wessex during late 871 and into 872 forced Alfred to negotiate peace through payment of tribute, marking the first time that the West Saxon kingdom had purchased temporary respite from Viking attacks through financial concessions rather than achieving military victory. The precedent established by this negotiated settlement, though necessary given West Saxon military exhaustion and the arrival of Viking reinforcements, created patterns of tribute payment that would recur throughout Alfred's reign and eventually evolve into the systematic Danegeld exactions that characterized later Viking Anglo-Saxon relations. The period following the 872 settlement witnessed temporary reduction in Viking pressure on Wessex, as the raiders turned their attention to completing the conquest of Mercia, the last remaining Anglo-Saxon kingdom, besides Wessex, that retained any semblance of independent authority. The Viking army's establishment of winter quarters at London during 871 to 872, followed by their movement to Torksey and Lindsey during 872 to 873, and then to Repton in Mercia during 873 to 874, demonstrated systematic progression of conquest that isolated and pressured the Mercian kingdom. The expulsion of King Burgred from Mercia during 874, following his inability to organize effective resistance against Viking occupation, completed the destruction of the four major Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that had dominated English political geography for centuries. Burgred's flight to Rome, where he died in exile, symbolized the comprehensive nature of the Anglo-Saxon political collapse and the replacement of traditional authority structures with Viking military control. The installation of Ceolwulf II as a puppet king, ruling portions of Mercia under Viking oversight, paralleled the earlier arrangement in Northumbria and demonstrated Viking willingness to maintain facades of Anglo-Saxon authority when such arrangements served their administrative convenience and facilitated resource extraction from subject populations. The division of the Great Army during 874, with substantial forces under Halfdan, moving northward to Northumbria, while another contingent under Guthrum concentrated on completing the conquest of eastern England, reflected strategic calculations about the most effective deployment of Viking military strength across territories they now controlled. Halfdan's campaigns in Northumbria during 875 through 877, which included raids into Pictish territories north of the former Anglo-Saxon kingdom and attacks on the kingdom of Strathclyde, demonstrated the geographical scope of Viking military operations during this period and their ability to conduct simultaneous campaigns across multiple fronts. The distribution of land to Viking warriors in Northumbria during 876, recorded in Anglo-Saxon chronicle entries that mark the transition from military occupation to permanent settlement, initiated the process by which conquered territories became areas of Scandinavian colonization, rather than simply regions subjected to temporary military control and tribute extraction. The establishment of Viking settlements in conquered Anglo-Saxon territories during the mid-870s represented a fundamental transformation in the nature of Scandinavian presence in England, as temporary raiding camps and military occupation gave way to permanent communities of Scandinavian farmers and their families who displaced previous Anglo-Saxon landholders. The archaeological evidence for this settlement process, including Scandinavian-style artifacts, burial practices, and architectural forms appearing in formerly Anglo-Saxon regions, corroborates the textual sources, indicating substantial population transfers from Scandinavia to England during this period. The linguistic evidence preserved in place names throughout eastern England, where Scandinavian naming patterns and vocabulary replaced or modified Anglo-Saxon toponyms, demonstrates the depth of cultural transformation that accompanied political conquest. The appearance of hybrid place name forms combining Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon elements suggests complex processes of cultural interaction and gradual linguistic evolution, rather than simple replacement of one population by another, though the precise demographic proportions between Scandinavian settlers and surviving Anglo-Saxon inhabitants remain subjects of scholarly debate. The renewed Viking assault on Wessex during January 878, led by Guthrum, with forces that had spent the previous years consolidating control over East Anglia, caught West Saxon defences unprepared and achieved stunning initial success that nearly completed the conquest of England by subjugating its last independent Anglo-Saxon kingdom. The surprise attack on the royal estate at Chippenham during the Christmas season, when military operations normally ceased and defensive preparations remained minimal, demonstrated Viking tactical opportunism and willingness to exploit Anglo-Saxon cultural expectations about the sanctity of religious holidays. The attack's success scattered West Saxon resistance and forced Alfred to flee into the Somerset marshes with a small band of loyal followers, creating circumstances in which the West Saxon kingdom effectively ceased to function as a coherent political entity. The 6 months between the January 878 attack and Alfred's counteroffensive in May represented the nadir of Anglo-Saxon fortunes and the moment when Viking conquest of all England appeared inevitable and imminent. Alfred's refuge in the Somerset marshes, though remembered in later legendary accounts that emphasized his isolation and disguise among common people who failed to recognize their king, actually involved systematic preparation for counterattack through maintenance of contact with loyal Vignes and coordination of resistance activities in regions where West Saxon authority survived. The construction of a fortification at Athelney, positioned on firm ground within the marshland that provided both defensive security and access to surrounding territories, served as headquarters for organizing the military response that would emerge during spring 878. The gathering of West Saxon forces during May 878, drawing upon fyrds from Somerset, Wiltshire, and Hampshire that had avoided destruction during the initial Viking assault, demonstrated that Alfred retained sufficient political authority to summon military forces despite his months in hiding and the apparent collapse of his kingdom. The army's morale, described in chronicle accounts as reflecting great joy at their king's survival and renewed leadership, indicated that Alfred commanded personal loyalty that transcended the political disasters of previous months. The Battle of Eddington, fought during May 878 at a location identified with modern Eddington in Wiltshire, represented the decisive engagement that determined whether Alfred would reclaim his kingdom or suffer final defeat that would complete Viking conquest of England. The battle's outcome, which resulted in comprehensive West Saxon victory and Viking retreat to their fortified position at Chippenham, marked a crucial turning point that reversed the trajectory of conquest that had seemed inexorable since the great heathen army's arrival 13 years earlier. The siege of Viking forces at Chippenham, which concluded with negotiated surrender after 14 days, rather than the prolonged resistance that fortified positions normally enabled, reflected the scale of Viking casualties and demoralization resulting from their battlefield defeat. The surrender terms, which required Guthrum and 30 of his leading men to accept Christian baptism and included provisions for Viking withdrawal from Wessex, represented Alfred's recognition that military victory alone could not eliminate the Viking presence in England, but could establish terms for coexistence that protected West Saxon independence. The Treaty of Wedmore, negotiated following the Battle of Eddington and formalized during subsequent weeks, established the framework for Viking-West Saxon relations during the following years and implicitly recognized the partition of England between Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian-controlled territories. The treaty's provisions regarding Guthrum's baptism, with Alfred serving as his godfather in a ceremony rich with symbolic significance about political submission and cultural integration, reflected early medieval Christian beliefs about the transformative power of conversion and the creation of spiritual kinship bonds that superseded ethnic differences. The practical political implications of Guthrum's baptism remained ambiguous, as the extent to which his conversion represented genuine religious conviction, political expediency, or merely the price of honourable withdrawal from military disaster cannot be determined from available sources. The Viking withdrawal from Wessex to East Anglia during 878, followed by their settlement in that region under Guthrum's leadership, created the first stable territorial division between Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian political authority in England. The formalization of boundaries between West Saxon and Viking-controlled territories occurred through a subsequent treaty, preserved in a document known as the Treaty of Alfred and Guthrum, though its precise dating remains uncertain and was probably concluded during the early 880s. The treaty's provisions established a frontier running roughly from London northwestward, along the River Lea to its source, then to Bedford, and along the River Oss to Watling Street, the Roman road running from London to Chester. This boundary left London itself, along with substantial portions of former Mercian territories, within the zone of Viking control that contemporary sources began identifying through the term Danelaw, meaning the area where Danish law and customs held authority rather than Anglo-Saxon legal traditions. The treaty's detailed provisions regarding legal procedures, compensation for injuries, and the status of individuals crossing the frontier reflected pragmatic recognition that the two populations would maintain economic and social contacts despite political partition. The period following the Treaty of Wedmore witnessed Alfred's systematic efforts to reconstruct West Saxon military capabilities and implement defensive innovations designed to prevent repetition of the near disaster that had occurred during 878. The fortification program that Alfred initiated during the 880s, documented in a text known as the Burghall Heidage, that lists 33 fortified sites established throughout Wessex and English Mercia, represented the most comprehensive defensive infrastructure project undertaken in early medieval England. Each fortification, known as a burh, received a garrison whose size was calculated based on the length of walls requiring defence, with the formula allocating 1 man for each 5.5 yards of perimeter. The garrisoning obligations were distributed across surrounding territories through assessment of land units measured in hides, creating systematic linkages between agricultural resources and defensive requirements that enabled sustained maintenance of fortifications without excessive burden on any particular locality. The burh network's geographical distribution ensured that no location in Wessex or English Mercia lay more than approximately 20 miles from a fortified refuge, providing civilian populations with accessible protection during Viking raids while creating obstacles to enemy movement through the kingdom. The military reforms accompanying the fortification program addressed fundamental weaknesses in Anglo-Saxon defensive capabilities that Viking raids had repeatedly exploited. The division of the fyrd into 2 components, serving alternate periods of military duty, enabled Alfred to maintain standing forces in the field without depleting agricultural labour to the point where crop production suffered. This rotation system, which kept half the fyrd in active service, while the other half remained available for agricultural work or local defence, provided the sustained military presence necessary for garrisoning burhs and responding to Viking movements, without the exhaustion that had characterized the continuous campaigning of 870 to 872. The creation of a standing naval force, which the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle credits Alfred with establishing as a counter to Viking maritime superiority, represented an attempt to contest Scandinavian control of coastal waters and challenge raiders at sea, rather than waiting until they landed and established fortified positions. The ships built for Alfred's navy, described as larger and more stable than Viking vessels, though less maneuverable, reflected the king's understanding that matching Viking maritime capabilities required both resources and time that would not produce immediate results, but might provide long-term advantages. The administrative and legal reforms that Alfred implemented during the 880s and 890s, though less immediately connected to military defense than the burh system and feared reorganization, reflected his comprehensive vision for West Saxon recovery and strengthening against future Viking threats. The law code that Alfred promulgated, drawing upon earlier Anglo-Saxon legal traditions while introducing innovations tailored to contemporary circumstances, served multiple purposes, including the assertion of royal authority, the standardization of legal procedures across territories recently recovered from Viking control, and the articulation of Christian principles underlying legitimate governance. The code's provisions, addressing relationships between Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian populations, specifying compensation rates for injuries and establishing procedures for resolving disputes between individuals from different ethnic groups, acknowledged the new demographic realities created by Viking settlement, while attempting to integrate Scandinavian inhabitants into Anglo-Saxon legal frameworks. The emphasis on written documentation and literacy requirements for officials reflected Alfred's belief that effective governance required educated administrators capable of understanding and implementing complex legal and administrative procedures. The cultural and educational initiatives that formed a central component of Alfred's program for West Saxon renewal addressed what the king identified as catastrophic decline in learning and literacy resulting from Viking destruction of monasteries and the death or displacement of educated clerics who had maintained Anglo-Saxon intellectual traditions. Alfred's assessment of the situation, preserved in his preface to the translation of Pope Gregory's Pastoral Care, lamented that few men south of the Humber, and even fewer north of that river, could understand Latin religious services or translate Latin texts into English. This dramatic decline from earlier centuries when Anglo-Saxon England had produced scholars like Bede and Alcuin, whose learning influenced continental Europe, created practical problems for governance and administration, as well as representing cultural loss. Alfred's response involved recruiting scholars from Mercia, Wales, and Francia to establish a program of translation that would make essential Latin texts available in English, enabling the education of officials and clerics who could not master Latin but needed access to the knowledge contained in ecclesiastical and secular literature. The king's personal involvement in translation projects, including his rendering of Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy and Augustine's Soliloquies into English, demonstrated his commitment to educational revival and provided royal example meant to inspire nobles and clerics to similar scholarly endeavours. The relative peace between Wessex and the Danelaw during the 15 years following the Treaty of Wedmore proved temporary, as renewed Viking attacks during the 890s tested Alfred's defensive innovations and required West Saxon military forces to respond to threats from both existing Scandinavian populations in eastern England and new raiders arriving from continental Europe. The renewed warfare's immediate catalyst involved a large Viking fleet that crossed from Francia to England during 892, led by a chieftain named Haston, who had conducted extensive raids on the continent during previous decades. The fleet's arrival coincided with rebellious movements among Scandinavian populations in the Danelaw, creating coordinated threats that strained West Saxon defensive capabilities, despite the improvements Alfred had implemented. The campaign that unfolded during 892 through 896 involved complex movements of Viking forces attempting to penetrate West Saxon defences, while Alfred's armies and those of his son Edward pursued raiders and besieged their fortified camps. The Anglo-Saxon chronicles detailed entries for these years, which described specific engagements and Viking movements with unusual precision, reflected contemporary understanding that this renewed warfare represented a crucial test of the defensive system created during the previous 15 years. The Viking strategy during this renewed conflict involved attempts to establish fortified bases from which to conduct raids while avoiding pitched battles against superior West Saxon forces. The construction of fortifications at locations including Benfleet, Shoebury, and elsewhere along the Thames estuary followed patterns established during earlier Viking campaigns, with raiders selecting defensible positions that maintained access to their ships while providing security against Anglo-Saxon attacks. The West Saxon response, which combined mobile field armies capable of pursuing Viking forces with garrison troops defending the Bur network, demonstrated the military flexibility that Alfred's reforms had created. The capture of the Viking fort at Benfleet during 893, which resulted in the seizure of ships, supplies, and the families that raiders had brought from Francia, illustrated how the Bur system's defensive capabilities freed West Saxon mobile forces to conduct offensive operations without leaving civilian populations vulnerable to attack. The recovery of Haston's wife and sons from the captured fort, and Alfred's decision to return them safely rather than holding them hostage or selling them as slaves, demonstrated the king's understanding of how generous treatment of defeated enemies might encourage future cooperation and reduce the intensity of subsequent conflicts. The failure of the 892 through 896 Viking campaigns to achieve significant territorial gains or to force major West Saxon concessions validated Alfred's defensive strategy and demonstrated that systematic fortification combined with reformed military organization could effectively counter Viking threats. The gradual dispersal of Viking forces during 896, with some raiders returning to continental Europe and others settling in the Danelaw or accepting land grants in return for peace agreements, marked the end of the last major Viking assault during Alfred's reign. The king's death on October 26, 899, occurred during a period of relative security when the West Saxon kingdom he had preserved during its darkest crisis had emerged as the dominant Anglo-Saxon power and the only kingdom maintaining effective independence against Scandinavian control. The succession of his son Edward, who became known as Edward the Elder, proceeded smoothly despite the theoretical claims of his cousin Ethelwald, whose father Ethelred had reigned before Alfred. Ethelwald's unsuccessful rebellion, which involved fleeing to the Danelaw and attempting to raise support for his claims among Scandinavian populations, demonstrated the political stability that Alfred had established and the acceptance of his designated successor among both Anglo-Saxon nobility and military forces. Edward the Elder's reign, from 899 to 924, witnessed the systematic West Saxon conquest of the Danelaw territories south of the Humber, transforming the political geography of England through military campaigns that recovered lands lost during the Viking invasions of the 860s and 870s. The reconquest proceeded gradually through a series of campaigns that combined military force with fortification, construction, and diplomatic negotiations, reflecting lessons learned from Alfred's defensive strategies while applying them to offensive operations aimed at territorial expansion. The collaboration between Edward and his sister Ethelflad, who ruled Mercia as Lady of the Mercians, following her husband Ethelred's death in 911, provided crucial coordination between West Saxon and Mercian forces that enabled simultaneous pressure on Viking-controlled territories from multiple directions. Ethelflad's independent authority in Mercia, which contemporary sources acknowledge through her title and her leadership of Mercian military forces, represented an unusual example of female political and military leadership in early medieval England, and demonstrated the pragmatic flexibility of Anglo-Saxon political arrangements when circumstances required. The campaign strategy employed during Edward and Ethelflad's reconquest involved systematic construction of burhs in newly conquered territories, creating permanent fortifications that prevented Viking reoccupation of areas from which Anglo-Saxon forces had expelled Scandinavian rulers. The coordination between military campaigns and fortification construction, with burhs established immediately following successful offensives to consolidate territorial gains, demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the relationship between mobile military operations and the fixed defensive infrastructure necessary for maintaining control over conquered territories. The conquest of East Anglia during 917, achieved through military victory over Viking forces defending their settlements, eliminated one of the major Scandinavian political entities established during the 870s and brought substantial territories under West Saxon control. The submission of Viking leaders in the 5 boroughs of Derby, Leicester, Lincoln, Nottingham, and Stamford during 918, following Ethelflad's capture of Derby and Leicester in previous years, marked the incorporation of Midland England's major Scandinavian centres into the expanding Anglo-Saxon realm. The political integration of conquered territories posed challenges distinct from the military operations that secured their control. As the substantial Scandinavian populations settled during previous decades retained their cultural identities, legal traditions, and economic relationships even after submitting to Anglo-Saxon political authority. The preservation of Scandinavian legal customs within regions that accepted Anglo-Saxon rule, evidenced by the continued use of the term Danelaw to describe areas where Danish, rather than West Saxon law, governed local affairs, reflected pragmatic recognition that successful governance required accommodation of established practices rather than wholesale imposition of West Saxon institutions. The maintenance of Scandinavian place names, social terminology, and administrative structures in conquered territories demonstrates the limited extent of cultural transformation that accompanied political reconquest, with Anglo-Saxon rulers exercising authority over populations that remained substantially Scandinavian in ethnic identity and daily practices. The Viking Kingdom of York, which had maintained independence throughout Edward the Elder's campaigns in southern and Midland England, represented the most significant remaining Scandinavian political entity and the primary obstacle to complete Anglo-Saxon control over England. The kingdom's rulers during the early 10th century, who claimed descent from Ragnar Lothbrok's legendary son Ivar, according to later sources, maintained authority over territories extending from the Humber northward through former Northumbrian lands, and established diplomatic relationships with Scandinavian powers in Ireland and Scotland. The geographical extent of York's territory and its political connections with other Scandinavian settlements throughout the Irish Sea region created strategic challenges for Anglo-Saxon rulers seeking to extend their authority northward from the territories controlled by Edward and Ethelflad. The kingdom's position controlling land routes between England and Scotland made its submission essential for establishing comprehensive Anglo-Saxon authority throughout Britain, while its maritime connections with Scandinavian powers meant that military conquest alone might prove insufficient for permanent incorporation into an Anglo-Saxon realm. The succession crisis, following Edward the Elder's death on July 17, 924, temporarily disrupted the momentum of Anglo-Saxon expansion and created opportunities for Viking resistance to Anglo-Saxon authority in recently conquered territories. The contested succession between Edward's sons Elfweard, who died within weeks of his father, and Ethelstan, whose legitimacy some contemporary sources questioned due to his mother's uncertain status, created political uncertainty that Viking leaders in York and elsewhere attempted to exploit. Ethelstan's eventual consolidation of power and his acceptance as king in Wessex, and the conquered Danelaw territories by 925 enabled resumption of the expansionist policies that Edward and Ethelflad had pursued. The new king's military capabilities and political ambitions exceeded even his accomplished father's achievements, as Ethelstan pursued a comprehensive program aimed at establishing his authority as king of all Britain, rather than merely ruler of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and conquered Danish territories. The conquest of Viking York during 927, achieved through military campaign whose details remain obscure in surviving sources, represented the culmination of 3 decades of Anglo-Saxon territorial recovery and established Ethelstan's authority over all of England, south of the Humber, and substantial territories to the north. The expulsion of the last Scandinavian king of York, identified in sources as Guthfrith, eliminated the final independent Viking political entity established during the 8th century conquests, and created the conditions for Ethelstan's claim to rule all of England. The submission of various northern rulers, including the King of Scots and the ruler of Strathclyde, at a ceremony at Amont Bridge near Penrith on July 12, 927, formalised recognition of Ethelstan's supremacy throughout Britain and represented the high point of Anglo-Saxon political achievement during the 10th century. The oaths sworn at Amont Bridge, which committed the participating rulers to cooperation in suppressing Viking activity and maintaining peace under Ethelstan's overlordship, created a political structure that, however temporarily, subordinated the various kingdoms of Britain to a single Anglo-Saxon ruler. The Battle of Brunanburh, fought during 937 at a location whose identification remains debated among historians, tested Ethelstan's authority against a coalition of forces that included Vikings from Ireland, the King of Scots, and the ruler of Strathclyde. The battle's immediate catalyst involved the return of Olaf Guthfrithson from Ireland, with military forces intent on reclaiming the Viking kingdom of York that Ethelstan had conquered a decade earlier. The scale of the engagement, which involved armies substantially larger than typical early medieval battles in Britain, reflected the stakes involved, as both sides recognized that the outcome would determine whether Ethelstan's unified rule would endure or whether Viking political authority would be re-established in northern England. The Anglo-Saxon victory, celebrated in a famous poem inserted into the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle that described the battle in heroic terms and claimed unprecedented slaughter of enemies, secured Ethelstan's authority for the remainder of his reign and demonstrated Anglo-Saxon military superiority over Viking forces when battles occurred under favourable circumstances. The death of Ethelstan on October 27, 939, created the succession crisis and political instability that Viking leaders had awaited for opportunities to recover lost territories. The succession of his half-brother Edmund, who was only 18 years old when he became king, encouraged Viking leaders in Ireland to believe that the military prowess and political authority that Ethelstan had exercised would not automatically transfer to his young successor. The invasion of northern England by Olaf Guthfrithson during 939 achieved rapid success that contrasted sharply with his defeat at Brunanburh 2 years earlier, suggesting that Ethelstan's personal military leadership had been crucial to previous Anglo-Saxon victories. The recovery of York and the 5 boroughs by Viking forces during 939 and 940 represented a stunning reversal of the territorial gains that Edward, Ethelflad, and Ethelstan had achieved during the previous 4 decades, demonstrating the fragility of Anglo-Saxon control over regions with substantial Scandinavian populations, who welcomed liberation from Anglo-Saxon rule. The Treaty of Leicester, negotiated during 940 between King Edmund and the Viking leaders who had recovered the 5 boroughs, formalized the partition of England along lines similar to those established by Alfred and Guthrum 60 years earlier. The treaty's provisions, which recognized Viking control over territories north of Watling Street, while confirming Edmund's authority over regions to the south, represented a pragmatic acceptance of military realities and reflected the young king's recognition that immediate reconquest of lost territories exceeded current Anglo-Saxon military capabilities. The treaty's temporary nature became apparent when Olaf Guthfrithson's death during 941 created succession disputes among Viking leaders that Edmund exploited to recover the 5 boroughs during 942. The rapid reconquest of these Midland territories, achieved in a single campaign season, demonstrated that Viking political control remained vulnerable to Anglo-Saxon military pressure when internal divisions prevented unified resistance. The conquest of the Viking kingdom of York during 944, accomplished after 2 years of military pressure and diplomatic maneuvering, represented Edmund's most significant achievement and restored the territorial extent of Ethelstan's realm. The expulsion of the last Scandinavian kings of York, identified in sources as Ragnall and Olaf Sigtryggsson, eliminated the independent Viking political authority in northern England, though it failed to eliminate the substantial Scandinavian population or fundamentally alter the cultural character of regions that had experienced several generations of Viking settlement. The assassination of King Edmund on May 26, 946, by an exiled thief whom the king confronted during a feast at Pucklechurch, shocked contemporaries through its senseless violence and its demonstration that even successful kings who had recovered lost territories and restored Anglo-Saxon authority over all England remained vulnerable to unpredictable attacks. From individuals bearing personal grievances, the succession of Edmund's brother Edred, the last surviving son of Edward the Elder, occurred during circumstances requiring immediate attention to threats of renewed Viking independence in York. The Kingdom of York's strategic importance and its Scandinavian population's resistance to permanent incorporation into an Anglo-Saxon realm made northern England the primary focus of Edred's reign from 946 to 955. The acceptance of Norwegian ruler Erik Bloodaxe by York's Scandinavian population during 947, following his expulsion from Norway by his brother Hakon, created a new variant of Viking political authority in northern England, as Erik's claims derived from Norwegian royal lineage, rather than the Dublin-based Scandinavian networks that had previously provided York's kings. Erik's initial expulsion from York during 948, followed by his restoration in 952, and final expulsion and death in 954, reflected the complex political dynamics of mid-10th century northern England, where Anglo-Saxon, Scandinavian, and indigenous Northumbrian interests competed for dominance. The permanent incorporation of York and northern England into the Anglo-Saxon realm, following Erik Bloodaxe's death in 954, marked the definitive end of independent Viking political authority in England, after nearly 90 years of Scandinavian rule in various regions. The absence of subsequent Viking kings in York, despite the continued substantial Scandinavian population and cultural character of the region, reflected Edred's success in establishing administrative structures and political arrangements that prevented resurgence of independent Viking kingdoms. The transformation of former Viking territories into regions governed by Anglo-Saxon kings through appointed officials, while maintaining substantial elements of Scandinavian legal and social customs, created the distinctive cultural landscape of late 10th century England, where Anglo-Saxon political supremacy overlay populations retaining considerable Scandinavian cultural identity. The reform of English monasticism during the reign of King Edgar, from 959 to 975, led by churchmen, including Dunstan, Ethelwold, and Oswald, addressed the ecclesiastical devastation resulting from Viking raids and conquests during the 9th century. The systematic re-establishment of monasteries, according to Benedictine rule, documented in a text known as the Regularis Concordia, that established uniform observance for English religious houses, represented the most comprehensive ecclesiastical reform program undertaken since the Christianization of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The close cooperation between royal authority and monastic reformers, with King Edgar providing political support and material resources for the reform movement, while church leaders supplied ideological justification for royal power, created a symbiotic relationship that strengthened both secular and ecclesiastical institutions. The reformers' destruction of records from the previous centuries, which they regarded as representing a degraded ecclesiastical culture that deserved no preservation or veneration, created significant gaps in historical documentation, while facilitating the construction of new narratives about England's Christian past that emphasized discontinuity between pre-reform corruption and post-reform purity. The succession crisis following Edgar's death on July 8, 975, and the subsequent murder of his son Edward at Corfe Castle on March 18, 978, created political instability that undermined the strong royal authority Edgar had exercised. The accession of Edgar's younger son Ethelred, who became known as Ethelred the Unrad, meaning ill-counselled or lacking good counsel rather than unready as later tradition mistranslated the epithet, occurred when he was approximately 10 years old and required regency arrangements that fractured royal authority among competing noble factions. The resumption of Viking raids on England during the 980s, after a hiatus of approximately 3 decades, during which Anglo-Saxon England had experienced relative freedom from major Scandinavian attacks, coincided with this period of political weakness and demonstrated how royal authority's fragmentation created vulnerabilities that external enemies could exploit. The renewed Viking attacks that began during 980 manifested patterns distinct from earlier raids, as the attackers included forces from Norway, Denmark, and Scandinavian settlements in Ireland, rather than representing coordinated campaigns by unified political entities. The raid on Southampton during 980, followed by attacks on Thanet, Cheshire, and Devon in subsequent years, suggested opportunistic operations by independent warbands rather than systematic conquest campaigns comparable to the Great Heathen Army's 9th century operations. The English military response, hampered by factional conflicts among Ethelred's advisors and the absence of strong royal leadership during his minority, proved inadequate to prevent escalating attacks. The defeat of an English army at the Battle of Maldon in Essex on August 10, 991, where the Caldorman Byrhtnoth died leading Essex forces against Viking raiders, demonstrated continuing problems in coordinating effective military responses despite the defensive infrastructure that Alfred and his successors had created. The poem, known as the Battle of Maldon, composed shortly after the event and preserved in fragmentary form, provided detailed description of the engagement, while articulating aristocratic martial values that emphasized honor and loyalty over practical military effectiveness. The poem's account of Byrhtnoth's decision to permit Viking forces to cross from Northey Island to the mainland, rather than maintaining the defensive advantage provided by the causeway, reflected heroic ideals about offering opponents fair fighting conditions that contradicted prudent military strategy. The poem's celebration of Thegnes, who chose to die fighting beside their fallen lord rather than fleeing to safety, articulated bonds between lords and retainers that formed the ideological foundation of Anglo-Saxon military service, even as the battle's outcome demonstrated the practical limitations of these aristocratic values. When confronting opponents who prioritized victory over honor, the decision to pay tribute to Viking raiders, rather than continuing military resistance, marked the beginning of systematic Danegeld payments that would characterize Ethelred's reign and drain enormous wealth from England during the following decades. The first recorded Danegeld payment in 991, which involved £10,000 of silver delivered to Viking forces in return for temporary cessation of raids, established precedents for subsequent payments that escalated in size as raiders recognized England's willingness to purchase peace through financial concessions. The terminology of Danegeld itself, meaning Danish tax or tribute, acknowledged the systematic character of these extractions and distinguished them from occasional tribute payments that earlier Anglo-Saxon rulers had made during military emergencies. The long-term consequences of establishing regular Danegeld payments included the creation of expectations among Scandinavian warriors that England represented a reliable source of wealth, obtainable through threatened violence, rather than actual conquest or sustained military campaigning. The escalation of tribute payments during the 990s and early years of the 11th century reflected both increasing Viking pressure and English political leadership's failure to organize effective military resistance. The payment of £16,000 in 994, followed by £24,000 in 1002 and £36,000 in 1007, demonstrated rapidly increasing costs of purchasing temporary peace, while indicating that previous payments had merely encouraged additional demands rather than permanently resolving the Viking threat. The sources of funding for these enormous tribute payments, which far exceeded normal government revenues and required extraordinary taxation of the English population, created economic hardships that contemporary sources documented through complaints about excessive taxation and the conversion of free peasants into dependent laborers as families sold land or accepted subordinate social status to meet tax obligations. The presence of Scandinavian mercenaries serving in Ethelred's military forces during this period created additional complications as the ethnic distinction between English defenders and Viking raiders became increasingly ambiguous. The recorded employment of Viking warriors by English authorities, including substantial forces led by chieftains like Palig and Thorkel the Tall, reflected pragmatic recognition that Scandinavian military expertise and naval capabilities might serve defensive purposes if properly compensated and controlled. The massacre of Street, Bryce's Day, ordered by Ethelred on November 13, 1002, represented a catastrophic breakdown in relations between English authorities and Scandinavian residents or mercenaries. Contemporary sources provided limited, reliable information about the massacre's extent, though it clearly resulted in deaths of Scandinavians throughout regions under English control and created lasting enmity that would influence subsequent Viking campaigns against England. The invasion of England by Svein Forkbeard, King of Denmark, during 1003 directly responded to the Street, Bryce's Day massacre, which reportedly included the death of Swein's sister Gunhild, who had been living in England. The campaign's character shifted from raiding aimed at tribute extraction toward conquest, seeking political control over England, marking a new phase in Viking-English relations that would culminate in Danish rule over the entire kingdom. Sweyn's campaigns during 1003 through 1005 demonstrated systematic approach to territorial conquest that combined military pressure with diplomatic negotiations aimed at securing submission of English regions without requiring costly battles. The temporary withdrawal of Sweyn's forces during 1005, following payment of £36,000 in tribute, provided brief respite that English authorities failed to utilize effectively for military preparation or political reform. The renewed invasion by Sweyn Forkbeard during 1013 proceeded with systematic efficiency that reflected strategic planning and military professionalism superior to English defensive efforts. The campaign began in northern England, where substantial Scandinavian populations welcomed Danish rule as preferable to the ineffective and increasingly oppressive government of Ethelred. The submission of the 5 boroughs, followed by Oxford and Winchester, demonstrated the collapse of English resistance as regions throughout the kingdom accepted Sweyn's authority rather than supporting Ethelred's discredited regime. The flight of Ethelred to Normandy during Christmas 1013, accompanied by his wife Emma, who was the sister of the Norman duke, marked the first time since the Viking invasions began that Anglo-Saxon England had lost independent political authority to a Scandinavian ruler. Sweyn's death on February 3rd, 1014, mere weeks after completing his conquest of England, created immediate succession crisis as both his son Canute and the exiled Ethelred claimed royal authority. The restoration of Ethelred following negotiation with English political leaders who agreed to accept him back as king on condition that he reform his governance and address the complaints that had made his rule intolerable demonstrated the conditional nature of early medieval kingship and subjects' ability to enforce constraints on royal power when circumstances permitted. The terms negotiated for Ethelred's return, preserved in Anglo-Saxon chronicle entries that describe the promises he made to govern more justly and consult with his advisors, represented an early articulation of principles limiting royal authority and establishing subjects' rights to demand governmental reform. The practical impact of these concessions remained limited, as Ethelred's death on April 23, 1016, occurred before any significant reforms could be implemented or their effectiveness assessed. The succession of Ethelred's son Edmund Ironside to the English throne coincided with Canute's renewed invasion, claiming the Danish conquest rights that his father Sweyn had established. The division of English political loyalty between Edmund, who controlled Wessex and portions of southern England, and Canute, whose authority extended over much of northern and eastern England, where Scandinavian populations predominated, created a brief period of partition, reminiscent of 9th century divisions between Alfred and Guthrum. The military campaigns during 1016 involved multiple battles between forces led by Edmund and Canute, with contemporary sources recording engagements at Penselwood, Schurston, and Asandun, the latter resulting in decisive Danish victory that killed numerous English nobles and destroyed Edmund's capacity for continued resistance. The negotiated settlement between Edmund and Canute, which partitioned England with Edmund retaining Wessex, while Canute controlled territories north of the Thames, survived only until Edmund's death on November 30th, 1016. Circumstances sufficiently suspicious that many contemporary observers suspected murder, though no conclusive evidence survived. The accession of Canute as sole king of all England following Edmund Ironside's death established the first comprehensive Danish rule over the kingdom since Sweyn Forkbeard's brief reign 3 years earlier. Canute's approach to governing his newly unified realm reflected sophisticated political calculations that balanced Danish supporters' interests with the need to conciliate English subjects and maintain the administrative systems that Anglo-Saxon kings had developed. The king's marriage to Emma of Normandy, widow of Ethelred and sister of the Norman duke, provided dynastic legitimacy that connected Canute to the Anglo-Saxon royal lineage, while maintaining diplomatic ties with continental powers. The promotion of English nobles to positions of authority alongside Danish warriors who had participated in the conquest demonstrated Canute's recognition that effective governance required cooperation from existing English elite rather than complete replacement with Scandinavian personnel. The legal and administrative continuity characterizing Canut's reign indicated that Danish conquest, despite its violent character and the political revolution it represented, preserved essential elements of Anglo-Saxon governmental structures. The law codes promulgated under Canut's authority maintained fundamental continuities with earlier Anglo-Saxon legislation, while incorporating provisions addressing specific issues raised by Danish rule and the presence of substantial Scandinavian populations. The preservation of shire and hundred administrative divisions, the continued use of English thegenes in local governance, and the maintenance of ecclesiastical structures under existing bishops demonstrated pragmatic recognition that wholesale institutional revolution would create chaos that served neither Danish nor English interests. The king's generous patronage of English monasteries and his cultivation of positive relationships with ecclesiastical leaders, including Archbishop Wulfstan of York, who served as one of his primary advisors and legal counselors, reflected understanding that religious institutions' support provided crucial legitimacy for Danish rule over a predominantly Christian English population. Canut's position as King of Denmark following his brother Harold's death in 1018, combined with his English kingdom, created a North Sea empire connecting Scandinavia with Britain that represented unprecedented political integration across these maritime regions. The acquisition of Norway during 1028 through military conquest and diplomatic pressure further expanded this empire's geographical scope and demonstrated Canut's ambitions exceeded mere control of England. The administrative challenges of governing territories separated by substantial sea distances, populated by ethnically diverse peoples, and lacking common institutional traditions required delegation of authority to subordinate rulers and the development of communication networks, maintaining coordination across the empire's various regions. The appointment of jarls to govern English regions during Canut's absences in Scandinavia, including figures like Eric of Halathir in Northumbria, and Thorkel, the Tall, whose authority extended over East Anglia and other territories, created aristocratic magnates wielding power comparable to the ealdormen who had governed regions under earlier Anglo-Saxon kings. The stability characterizing Canut's reign from 1016 until his death on November 12, 1035, contrasted sharply with the chaos and violence that had marked Ethelred's later years, and created conditions enabling economic recovery and cultural development. The cessation of Viking raids, which had previously been endemic throughout England during decades of political weakness, resulted directly from Canut's control over both England and Denmark, which eliminated the independent Scandinavian warbands, whose raiding had devastated English coastal regions. The security provided by unified rule across the North Sea enabled commercial expansion, as English merchants could trade with Scandinavian territories without risk of piracy or seizure by hostile forces. The minting of coins celebrating Canut's victories and depicting his imperial authority contributed to economic integration while serving propaganda purposes that legitimized Danish rule through imagery familiar from earlier Anglo-Saxon coinage. The ecclesiastical patronage and religious devotion that Canut demonstrated throughout his reign, including his pilgrimage to Rome in 1027, where he attended the coronation of the Holy Roman Emperor Conrad II, served multiple purposes, including personal religious conviction, political legitimacy enhancement, and diplomatic relationship development with continental powers. The grants that Canut made to English monasteries exceeded in generosity the endowments that most earlier Anglo-Saxon kings had provided, suggesting genuine commitment to Christian institutions despite his pagan Danish origins and the violence through which he had acquired his throne. The reform of ecclesiastical abuses, implementation of canonical discipline among clergy, and support for monastic observance. Regular rules demonstrated that Danish kingship could serve as effectively as Anglo-Saxon rule in promoting Christian values and supporting church institutions. The succession crisis following Canut's death revealed the fragility of the political settlement he had established, as competing claims divided loyalties between his sons by different marriages and the surviving son of Ethelred, unready. The accession of Harold Harefoot, Canut's son by his first wife Elfgifu of Northampton, occurred despite the superior claims of Harthacnut, Cnut's son by Emma of Normandy, who was absent in Denmark, securing his position there when his father died. The partition of authority between Harold, who controlled England, and Harthacnut, who remained in Denmark while being recognized as king in southern England, recreated the political divisions that had characterized earlier periods of Viking conflict with Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The death of Harold on March 17, 1040, and the subsequent peaceful accession of Harthacnut enabled restoration of unified rule, though the new king's brief reign, until his death on June 8, 1042, provided insufficient time for establishing stable governance or implementing significant policies. The restoration of the Anglo-Saxon royal line through the accession of Edward the Confessor, son of Ethelred the Unready, and Emma of Normandy, marked the formal end of Danish rule over England, though the cultural and demographic impact of several decades of Scandinavian political dominance continued shaping English society. Edward's long exile in Normandy, where he had spent nearly 3 decades, while Canute and his sons ruled England, meant that his accession brought Norman cultural influences and continental connections that would prove consequential for England's future development. The king's childlessness and the uncertainty surrounding succession arrangements created conditions for the political crisis that would culminate in the Norman conquest. Though the immediate context of Edward's reign involved primarily managing relationships between competing aristocratic factions, including both English nobles descended from earlier Anglo-Saxon elite and the Scandinavian aristocracy that Danish rule had established, the trial and outlawry of Godwin, Earl of Wessex during 1051, prompted by disputes over policy toward Norman influences at Edward's court and specific incidents involving violence against the king's foreign followers, demonstrated continuing tensions between English and continental factions competing for royal favor. Godwin's restoration following his return with military forces during 1052 revealed the limits of Edward's political authority and the power that great magnates exercised within the kingdom regardless of whether the king was of Anglo-Saxon or Scandinavian descent. The dominance of Godwin's family during Edward's later years, with his sons holding the earldoms of Wessex, Northumbria, and East Anglia, while his daughter Edith was married to the king, created political circumstances where royal authority existed more in theoretical than practical terms, and where the kingdom's actual governance depended upon cooperation between the king and the Godwinson family. The death of Edward the Confessor on January 5, 1066, and the succession crisis that immediately followed, created circumstances enabling the final significant Viking invasion of England and the eventual Norman conquest that would fundamentally transform English society. The coronation of Harold Godwinson as King Harold II on January 6, 1066, the day following Edward's death, occurred with such haste that it suggested the new king recognized challenges to his succession would emerge immediately. The competing claim of Harald Hardrada, King of Norway, who based his right to England on agreements supposedly negotiated between his predecessor Magnus and Harthacnut regarding succession if either died childless, represented the Viking world's final major attempt to establish Scandinavian rule over England. Harald Hardrada's alliance with Tostig Godwinson, Harold II's exiled brother, who had been expelled from his Northumbrian earldom and sought Norwegian support for restoration, created a formidable invasion force that landed in northern England during September 1066. The Battle of Fulford, fought on September 20, 1066, between the Norwegian invasion force and the northern English Earls Edwin of Mercia and Morcar of Northumbria, resulted in crushing Norwegian victory that left York vulnerable to occupation and demonstrated Harald Hardrada's military capabilities. The speed of King Harold's response, marching his army northward from London in approximately 4 days and covering nearly 200 miles to confront the Norwegian invasion before they could consolidate their position, demonstrated both the urgency with which he viewed the threat and the effectiveness of English military mobilization when capable leadership provided clear strategic direction. The Battle of Stamford Bridge, fought on September 25, 1066, culminated in decisive English victory that killed both Harold Hardrada and Tostig Godwinson, along with the majority of their invasion force. The battle's outcome effectively ended Norwegian ambitions to conquer England and marked the conclusion of the Viking Age's direct military threats to English independence. The news reaching Harold's victorious army at Stamford Bridge that William, Duke of Normandy, had landed on England's southern coast during the battle itself created the extraordinary circumstance requiring the English king to march his exhausted troops the length of England to confront a second invasion within 3 weeks of defeating the first. The Battle of Hastings, fought on October 14th, 1066, resulted in Norman victory and Harold's death, despite the English army's defensive strength and their success throughout most of the day in repelling Norman attacks against their shield wall, positioned on high ground. The long-term consequences of Norman conquest for Viking England would prove profound, as William the Conqueror and his Norman followers, themselves descendants of Vikings who had settled in northern France during the 10th century, imposed French feudal institutions and continental cultural influences that gradually eroded the Scandinavian character that substantial regions of England had maintained since the 9th century settlements. The final phase of Viking military activity in England occurred during rebellions against Norman rule in northern regions where Scandinavian cultural identity remained strong and where hostility toward Norman conquest found expression through appeals for assistance to Danish kings claiming residual rights to English territories. The invasion by Svein Estrithson of Denmark during 1069, coordinated with northern English rebellions against Norman authority, represented the last significant attempt by Scandinavian forces to influence English political development. The Danish fleet's arrival in the Humber and their occupation of York in coordination with English rebels demonstrated that substantial populations in northern England continued viewing Scandinavian rulers as preferable alternatives to Norman domination. The Norman response, known as the Harrying of the North during 1069 through 1070, involved systematic devastation of Yorkshire and neighbouring regions that killed thousands of civilians and destroyed agricultural infrastructure to eliminate the economic foundation supporting rebellion. William's brutal suppression of northern resistance, which contemporary and later chroniclers described as genocide in its scope and intensity, effectively destroyed the possibility of further Danish intervention by eliminating the population base that might support invasion. The withdrawal of Danish forces from England following negotiated settlement with William, which involved substantial payments and the recognition that conquest of Norman England exceeded Denmark's military capabilities, marked the definitive end of Viking military involvement in English affairs, after 3 centuries of raids, invasions, settlements, and periodic rule. The cultural legacy of Viking presence continued shaping English society through subsequent centuries, despite the political dominance of Norman conquerors who were themselves Viking descendants. The linguistic impact manifested through the thousands of Scandinavian loanwords incorporated into English vocabulary, particularly terms relating to law, social organization, and daily life that reflected the integration of Scandinavian settlers into English society. The place name evidence preserving Scandinavian toponymic elements throughout northern and eastern England demonstrated the depth of Viking settlement and the continued presence of populations descended from 9th and 10th century Scandinavian colonists. The legal traditions of the Danelaw regions, which maintained distinctive characteristics derived from Scandinavian customs despite incorporation into unified English kingdom, influenced the development of English common law through their emphasis on participatory decision-making and communal responsibility. The institution of the jury, which became fundamental to English legal procedure, showed Scandinavian influences through its reliance on community participation in legal proceedings, rather than decisions by appointed judges alone. The administrative divisions of Yorkshire into ridings, a term derived from Old Norse, thriðgunga, meaning third part, preserved Scandinavian organizational structures that had replaced earlier Anglo-Saxon administrative units. The persistence of these Scandinavian institutional forms centuries after the end of Viking political control testified to the profound impact that relatively brief periods of Scandinavian rule had achieved through systematic settlement and the establishment of enduring social structures. The Viking Age's impact on English historical development transcended the immediate political and military events of raids, conquests, and eventual defeat to encompass fundamental transformations in England's demographic composition, cultural character, and institutional structures. The necessity of responding to Viking threats had accelerated political consolidation processes that transformed England from multiple competing kingdoms into a unified realm, though the final achievement of that unification occurred through Norman conquest rather than Anglo-Saxon expansion. The creation of defensive infrastructure, including the burh system and reformed military organization, established precedents for systematic governance and territorial administration that continued influencing English political development. The religious and cultural revival, initiated as response to Viking destruction of monasteries, contributed to distinctive forms of English Christianity that synthesized Anglo-Saxon, Scandinavian, and continental influences. The long-term consequences of Viking presence in England manifested through demographic patterns, social structures, linguistic developments, and cultural practices that persisted long after political authority passed from Scandinavian to Norman and eventually to native English rulers. The genetic legacy of Viking settlement, traceable through modern DNA analysis of populations in regions that experienced intensive Scandinavian colonization, demonstrated that permanent demographic transformation accompanied temporary political control. The cultural exchange, flowing in both directions between Scandinavian and English populations, created hybrid societies where ethnic boundaries blurred over time and where cultural influences transcended political divisions. The literary traditions preserving memories of Viking Age conflicts, including both Anglo-Saxon texts, like the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, and later Norse sagas, recounting the same events from Scandinavian perspectives, provided historical sources whose richness and detail exceeded documentation available for most early medieval societies. The transformation of Viking presence from existential military threat during the 9th century through periods of Scandinavian political rule during the 10th and 11th centuries to eventual cultural assimilation created historical patterns repeating throughout English history as successive waves of invaders became permanent residents who contributed to evolving definitions of English identity. The Viking experience demonstrated both the destructive impact of external military pressure on established societies and the creative potential of cultural mixing when different populations coexisted within shared territories. The gradual integration of Scandinavian settlers into English society, which occurred through intermarriage, economic cooperation, and shared experiences of living under common political authorities, created precedents for subsequent processes by which foreign populations became English through extended residence and cultural adaptation. The memory of Viking Age events, preserved in chronicles, sagas, archaeological remains, and place names, continued influencing English historical consciousness and contributing to national narratives about resistance against foreign invasion and the eventual triumph of English political institutions over external threats. The enduring fascination with Viking Age history reflects both the period's dramatic character and its fundamental importance in shaping the medieval and modern England that emerged from centuries of conflict, accommodation, and eventual synthesis between Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian populations, sharing the territories that would become unified English kingdom. The material culture of Scandinavian settlers in England revealed adaptation patterns that distinguished permanent colonization from temporary military occupation, as archaeological evidence from sites throughout the Danelaw demonstrated the emergence of hybrid societies, blending Norse and Anglo-Saxon traditions, while developing distinctive characteristics that belonged exclusively to neither source culture. The settlements established by Danish and Norwegian colonists during the late 9th and early 10th centuries created communities that maintained Scandinavian social organization while adapting to the agricultural possibilities, economic structures of their new English territories. The domestic architecture of Scandinavian settlements demonstrated both continuity with homeland building traditions and adaptation to local materials. The longhouses, characteristic of Scandinavian rural settlements, appeared in modified forms at English settlement sites, typically measuring between 40 and 80 feet in length, constructed using timber framing with walls of wattle and daub depending on available materials. The internal organization divided space between human living quarters and animal housing, with central hearths providing heating and cooking facilities. The fusion of Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon architectural traditions produced building forms that borrowed elements from both cultures while responding to specific functional requirements of mixed agricultural and commercial economies, developing in Viking Age England. The urban settlements, particularly York, which became the largest Viking Age city in Britain, developed building types adapted to dense urban occupation, with narrow-fronted structures arranged along streets and extending considerable depths behind their street facades to maximize use of expensive urban land. The excavations at Coppergate in York during the 1970s and 80s revealed remarkably well-preserved remains of 10th century urban structures, including workshops, residences, and commercial buildings that demonstrated the specialized character of urban life in Viking Age England. These structures typically measured 15 to 20 feet in width along the street frontage, but extended 40 to 50 feet or more in depth, with internal divisions creating separate areas for manufacturing, storage, retail activities, and domestic occupation. The construction techniques employed in these urban buildings showed influences from both Scandinavian traditions of timber construction and Anglo-Saxon building practices, resulting in hybrid forms that belong distinctively to the Anglo-Scandinavian cultural sphere, developing in 10th century England. The agricultural practices established by Scandinavian settlers transformed landscapes throughout the Danelaw through the introduction of settlement patterns, land management techniques, and crop preferences that reflected both Norwegian and Danish farming traditions adapted to English environmental conditions. The place name evidence preserving Scandinavian toponymic elements across northern and eastern England identified thousands of settlements established by Viking Age colonists, with suffixes like by, thorp, thwaite, and toft indicating Scandinavian origins, while root elements often recorded the personal names of original settlers or described topographic and agricultural characteristics of settlement locations. The distribution of these place names revealed settlement patterns that favored marginal lands avoided by earlier Anglo-Saxon colonization, including higher elevations, more heavily forested areas, and regions with less favorable soils that required more intensive labor to bring into productive agricultural use. The willingness of Scandinavian settlers to occupy these marginal territories suggests either population pressure, forcing settlement of less desirable lands, or conscious selection of locations that provided some strategic advantage through difficult accessibility or distance from existing Anglo-Saxon population centers. The environmental impact of Viking Age agricultural expansion manifested through deforestation, drainage of wetlands, and establishment of field systems that remained visible in landscape evidence throughout subsequent centuries. The open field agricultural system characteristic of medieval English farming, with its organization of arable land into strips allocated among village residents and its coordination of planting, harvesting, and grazing activities through communal decision-making, showed influences from both Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian agricultural traditions. The archaeological evidence from excavated settlement sites revealed field boundaries, drainage ditches, and landscape modifications that documented the transformation of previously uncultivated or lightly exploited territories into intensively farmed agricultural lands. The pollen analysis from peat deposits and lake sediments recorded dramatic changes in vegetation patterns during the Viking Age, as forests gave way to agricultural landscapes dominated by cereal cultivation and grazing lands supporting sown livestock populations. The economic networks connecting Scandinavian settlements in England to broader trading systems encompassing the North Sea world, the Baltic, the Irish Sea Zone, and continental Europe created commercial relationships that transformed Viking Age England from the relative isolation of earlier centuries to integration within cosmopolitan exchange networks, linking distant regions through flows of goods, silver, and commercial information. The Viking trade routes, established initially to facilitate the distribution of plunder extracted through raiding, but evolving to support legitimate commerce in agricultural products, manufactured goods, and luxury items, created infrastructure, supporting economic expansion throughout regions of Scandinavian settlement. The urban centres that emerged or expanded during the Viking Age, including York, Lincoln, Nottingham, Derby, and Leicester, among the 5 boroughs of the Danelaw, developed specialised manufacturing districts, producing goods for export alongside markets where agricultural producers from surrounding rural areas exchanged their products for manufactured items, imported luxuries, and the silver that increasingly replaced barter as the medium of exchange. The numismatic evidence from coin hoards buried throughout Viking Age England revealed the monetary revolution accompanying Scandinavian settlement, as silver pennies replaced earlier systems of exchange based primarily on barter, supplemented by limited use of gold coins inherited from Roman and early Anglo-Saxon periods. The volume of silver entering England through Viking raiding, trading, and minting activities increased dramatically during the late 9th and 10th centuries, creating money supplies that enabled commercial expansion and market development impossible under earlier conditions of precious metal scarcity. The standardization of coinage, weight, and design under successive Viking rulers, beginning with the issues of Sistrick Cache at York during the early 10th century, and continuing through the systematic reforms undertaken by Aethelstan and his successors, facilitated commercial transactions by establishing reliable standards of value recognizable across political boundaries. The dies used to strike Viking Age coins frequently copied designs from Carolingian, Anglo-Saxon, and Byzantine sources, creating currency that declared political legitimacy through its mimicry of established monetary forms, while circulating in economic systems that transcended political control. The trade goods moving through Viking Age commercial networks included bulky agricultural products like grain and wool, alongside higher value manufactured items, including metalwork, textiles, and various luxury products that justified the transportation costs of long-distance trade. The archaeological evidence from urban excavation sites, particularly the remarkable preservation conditions at York's Coppergate site, where waterlogged soils protected organic materials from decay, revealed the range of manufacturing activities supporting urban economies during the Viking Age. The leatherworking establishments produced shoes, clothing, belts, scabbards, and various other items, using techniques inherited from both Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon traditions, while developing innovations responding to urban market demands. The metalworking shops manufactured tools, weapons, jewelry, and utilitarian hardware, using iron, copper alloys, lead, and precious metals, worked with sophisticated techniques including casting, forging, welding, and decorative treatments, producing both functional items and objects whose primary value derived from aesthetic qualities or symbolic significance. The textile production that constituted one of the most important manufacturing sectors in Viking Age economies left less direct archaeological evidence than metalworking or leather crafting, due to the perishable nature of organic materials. But the surviving traces documented sophisticated industries, producing both utilitarian fabrics and luxury textiles, commanding premium prices in local and export markets. The spindle whorls, loom weights, and occasional textile fragments, preserved through unusual preservation conditions, revealed techniques and products comparable to textiles produced throughout the medieval North Sea world. The wool production that supplied raw materials for textile manufacturing depended on sheep husbandry that formed an essential component of mixed agricultural economies throughout the Danelaw regions, with archaeological evidence suggesting selective breeding programs, producing sheep varieties optimized for wool production rather than meat alone. The export of English wool and finished textiles to continental markets, which would become major factors in later medieval English prosperity, had origins traceable to the commercial expansion of the Viking Age, when Scandinavian merchants integrated England into trading networks, extending throughout northern Europe and beyond. The commercial infrastructure supporting Viking Age trade included specialized port facilities, market towns, and overland transportation routes connecting producing regions with consumers throughout England and overseas markets accessed through maritime commerce. The development of Scandinavian-controlled ports, including York's River Harbour on the Ouse, the port facilities at Lincoln, accessing the Witham and North Sea connections beyond, and various smaller harbours along the east coast of England created nodes in maritime trading networks that linked England with Scandinavia, the Baltic region, the Carolingian Empire, and the Irish Sea Zone. The ships employed in commercial voyages differed from the warships used in raiding and military campaigns through their optimization for cargo capacity rather than speed and crew accommodation, with deeper drafts, wider beams, and reduced dependence on rowing in favor of sail power that permitted smaller crews relative to cargo capacity. The archaeological evidence from excavated or discovered ship remains, including the Skuldelev vessels from Roskilde Fjord in Denmark, which included both warships and cargo vessels, documented the range of ship types employed for different purposes within Viking Age maritime culture. The transformation of York into the primary urban centre of Viking Age northern England demonstrated the catalytic effect of Scandinavian settlement on urbanization processes that created the first true cities in Britain since the Roman period. The York that emerged during the 10th century as the capital of the Viking kingdom of Northumbria developed into a cosmopolitan commercial and manufacturing centre whose population, estimated between 10 and 15,000 inhabitants at its Viking Age peak, made it one of the largest cities in Britain and among the most important urban centres in northwestern Europe. The organisation of the city's economic life around specialised manufacturing districts, including areas devoted to metalworking, leather crafting, textile production, bone and antler working, and various other crafts, created concentrated expertise and facilitated the technological innovations that emerged from intense competition and information exchange within specialized trades. The street plan established during the Viking Age, with its characteristic narrow-fronted properties extending considerable depths behind street facades, created urban form that persisted through subsequent centuries as York continued developing as a major commercial and administrative centre. The archaeological investigations at Coppergate and surrounding areas revealed intimate details of daily life in Viking Age York through the exceptional preservation of organic materials in waterlogged soils that had protected leather, textiles, wooden objects, plant remains, and parasitic evidence that documented diet, health, and sanitary conditions in remarkable detail. The coprolite analysis, examining fossilized human feces recovered from 10th century contexts, revealed intestinal parasites indicating consumption of undercooked or contaminated food, alongside evidence of dietary patterns, emphasizing grain-based foods supplemented by meat, fish, and vegetables in proportions varying with season and social status. The plant remains, recovered through flotation and screening of excavated soils, documented the cultivated crops, including wheat, barley, oats, and various vegetables alongside wild plants gathered for food, medicine, or other purposes. The animal bones, found in enormous quantities throughout the excavated areas, revealed the relative importance of different livestock species in urban meat consumption, while butchery marks provided evidence about slaughtering practices, meat preparation techniques, and the distribution of different cuts reflecting social hierarchies and economic status. The religious transformation of Scandinavian settlers, from the pagan beliefs of their Scandinavian homelands to Christianity, represented one of the most significant cultural changes accompanying permanent settlement in England, as the practical impossibility of maintaining Norse religious practices within Christian kingdoms, combined with the social and economic advantages of conversion, to produce rapid Christianization of Viking populations during the 10th century. The process of religious conversion proceeded unevenly across the Danelaw regions, with variable chronology depending on local conditions, political circumstances, and the intensity of contact with Christian populations. But the archaeological and documentary evidence suggested that by the mid-10th century, most Scandinavian settlers had at least nominally converted to Christianity, even if elements of earlier beliefs persisted in popular religion, cultural practices. The conversion process left distinctive archaeological signatures in burial practices that showed gradual transformation from pagan cremation and furnished inhumation burials, reflecting Norse religious beliefs to Christian burial rites, with characteristic east-west orientation of graves, reduction or elimination of grave goods, and location in consecrated cemeteries, associated with churches, rather than dispersed burial grounds of pagan tradition. The sculptural evidence from Viking Age stone crosses, grave markers, and church decorations throughout northern England revealed the fusion of Scandinavian artistic traditions with Christian iconography and Anglo-Saxon decorative styles to produce distinctive Anglo-Scandinavian art forms that belonged to neither source culture exclusively. The cross shafts carved during the 10th century at sites including Gosforth in Cumbria, Middleton in Yorkshire, and numerous other locations throughout the Danelaw blended Christian symbols and biblical narratives with imagery derived from Norse mythology and Scandinavian artistic conventions in complex programs whose full meanings remain subjects of scholarly debate. The Gosforth cross, standing more than 14 feet high and preserving nearly complete its original 10th century carved decoration, displayed Christian themes, including the crucifixion alongside imagery that many scholars interpret as scenes from Norse mythology, including Ragnarok, the apocalyptic final battle of the gods. The interpretation of such syncretic imagery remains controversial, with some scholars reading the juxtaposition of Christian and Norse elements as deliberate theological statements about the compatibility or supersession of the old gods by the Christian revelation, while others suggest less systematic combinations, reflecting the artistic vocabulary available to carvers trained in Scandinavian decorative traditions, who applied familiar motifs to Christian subjects, without necessarily intending complex penned theological messages. The church-building activity sponsored by Scandinavian lords who converted to Christianity created physical infrastructure supporting religious transformation, while simultaneously asserting the political legitimacy and social status of Dane Viking elites through their patronage of Christian institutions. The churches, built under Scandinavian patronage, typically adopted architectural forms derived from Anglo-Saxon church-building traditions, rather than introducing Scandinavian building types, suggesting the absence of strong architectural traditions for Christian worship in the pagan Scandinavian homelands, and the necessity of borrowing forms from established Christian cultures. The small stone churches, built at numerous sites throughout the Danelaw during the 10th and early 11th centuries, many of which survive as parish churches still in use today, though usually much altered and expanded during subsequent medieval and modern periods, demonstrated the gradual establishment of parish systems, providing regular pastoral care to rural populations. The dedication of churches to Scandinavian saints, including Olaf, patron saint of Norway, whose cult spread rapidly throughout Scandinavian diaspora communities during the 11th century, indicated continuing cultural connections between Scandinavian settlers in England and their homelands, even after political separation. The women of Viking Age England occupied positions whose complexity and variety challenges simplistic generalizations about gender roles in either Scandinavian or Anglo-Saxon societies, as the documentary and archaeological evidence revealed women exercising authority, owning property, engaging in commerce, and participating in religious and cultural life with agency that varied significantly based on social status, family circumstances, and individual capabilities. The migration from Scandinavia included substantial female populations, accompanying or following male warriors and settlers, as genetic evidence from modern populations and the archaeological record of female burials throughout the Danelaw demonstrated permanent family settlements rather than purely military colonies. The distinctive female jewelry types found in Viking Age graves, including distinctive oval brooches worn in pairs to fasten women's dress at the shoulders, documented the presence of Scandinavian women, maintaining elements of traditional dress and adornment, even as other aspects of material culture showed adoption of English practices. The distribution patterns of these characteristic Scandinavian women's brooches, found in graves throughout Yorkshire, the East Midlands, and East Anglia, trace the geographic extent of Scandinavian settlement, while their concentration at particular sites indicated the centres of Scandinavian population. The documented cases of individual women exercising considerable authority in Viking Age northern England remained rare in surviving sources due to the masculine bias of medieval historical writing, but the occasional references to powerful women in positions of authority suggested that gender restrictions, while certainly present, did not absolutely prevent women from wielding political, economic, or religious power under favorable circumstances. The survival of Scandinavian women's names in place names throughout the Danelaw, though occurring less frequently than masculine names, indicated that women sometimes founded settlements or owned properties significant enough to attach their names to locations. The appearance of women's names in witness lists for charters and legal documents, though again less common than masculine names, documented women's participation in property transactions and their recognition as legal actors capable of entering binding agreements. The evidence from urban contexts, including York, suggested women's participation in commercial activities, particularly in textile production and retail trade activities, where female involvement appeared typical throughout medieval European urban societies. The linguistic legacy of Viking Age settlement transformed English language through the incorporation of thousands of Scandinavian loanwords and grammatical influences that fundamentally altered Old English in regions of intensive Scandinavian settlement, while contributing hundreds of loanwords to the English language more broadly. The linguistic interaction between Old English and Old Norse, the closely related Germanic languages spoken by Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian populations respectively, created bilingual communities where the similarities between the two languages facilitated communication even before extensive language learning occurred, while simultaneously producing linguistic borrowing and structural influences that permanently altered English language evolution. The Old Norse and Old English speakers could achieve basic communication despite their languages' distinct vocabularies and grammatical structures due to shared Germanic origins that maintained recognizable cognate relationships across many common words and similar syntax patterns, enabling reasonable comprehension even without formal language instruction. The loanwords adopted from Old Norse into English reflected the close daily contact between Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon populations, as the borrowed vocabulary included basic terms for family relationships, body parts, natural features, and everyday activities whose presence in loanword categories typically indicated intimate cultural contact and extended bilingualism rather than limited interaction between separate populations. The adoption of pronouns from Old Norse into English, including the third-person plural pronouns they, their, and them, which replaced the Old English equivalents, demonstrated the profound impact of Norse linguistic influence, as pronouns typically resist borrowing due to their fundamental role in grammar and the infrequency with which languages borrow core grammatical elements from other tongues. The replacement of Old English pronouns with Norse equivalents occurred because the Old English third-person plural forms, beginning with H, were confusingly similar to other pronouns, while the Old Norse forms beginning with th provided clearer distinction, leading English speakers in bilingual communities to adopt the Norse forms, whose functional advantage facilitated their spread even into English regions where Scandinavian settlement remained limited. The grammatical simplifications occurring in English during the late Old English and early Middle English periods showed potential Scandinavian influence through the reduction of inflectional endings and the simplification of gender, systems that characterized Old English grammar as the necessity of communication between speakers of related but distinct languages may have encouraged the elimination of grammatical complexities that impeded comprehension without conveying essential meaning. The loss of grammatical gender in English, transforming the language from the three-gender system of Old English to the natural gender system of modern English, where grammatical gender corresponds to biological sex for animate beings, while inanimate objects lack gender, contrasted with the retention of grammatical gender in German and other Germanic languages not subjected to similar intensive contact with related languages. The reduction of case endings and the increasing reliance on word order rather than inflectional morphology to indicate grammatical relationships followed patterns consistent with contact-induced linguistic change, though the precise extent to which Scandinavian contact caused, rather than merely accelerated, these changes remains debated among historical linguists. The place name evidence preserved throughout northern and eastern England documented the geographic extent and intensity of Scandinavian settlement, while simultaneously demonstrating the sustained contact between Scandinavian and English populations that produced hybrid place names, combining elements from both languages. The distribution of purely Scandinavian place names, with elements like by farm or village, thorp, secondary settlement, and toft, homestead, mapped the core areas of intensive Scandinavian colonization across Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, Leicestershire, Nottinghamshire, and Derbyshire, where these place name types appeared with sufficient density to indicate Scandinavian-speaking populations dominating local settlement patterns. The hybrid place names combining Scandinavian and English elements, which appeared throughout the Danelaw but particularly in transitional zones between regions of intensive Scandinavian settlement and areas remaining predominantly Anglo-Saxon, revealed the cultural mixing and linguistic borrowing occurring at the boundaries between populations and across time, as successive generations increasingly combined linguistic resources from both source languages. The personal names adopted by Scandinavian settlers and their descendants documented the gradual assimilation of Viking populations into English society through the progressive Anglicization of naming practices across generations, as the purely Scandinavian names typical of first-generation settlers gave way to hybrid combinations of Scandinavian and English name elements among their children, before evolving toward predominantly English naming patterns by the third generation. Though Scandinavian names never disappeared completely from regions of intensive Viking settlement, and occasionally revived in later periods when Viking heritage acquired positive associations. The process of naming pattern change occurred unevenly across the Danelaw, with regional and social variations, reflecting local demographics and the status accorded to Scandinavian versus English cultural identity in different communities and time periods. The survival of distinctively Scandinavian names in aristocratic families long after the end of Scandinavian political control indicated conscious preservation of Viking heritage among elites who derived legitimacy or status from Scandinavian ancestry, even as popular culture increasingly identified with English rather than Scandinavian cultural identity. The poetry and oral traditions of Viking Age England represented dimensions of cultural expression whose richness remains largely inaccessible to modern scholars due to the absence of contemporary written records preserving the oral performances through which Viking Age populations experience literature, history, and cultural memory. The oral culture of Scandinavian societies, which assigned prestige to skilled poets and storytellers, whose performances entertained aristocratic audiences while simultaneously preserving cultural memory and political legitimacy through recitations of dynastic genealogies, ancestral achievements, accompanied Scandinavian settlers to England, where it encountered the parallel oral traditions of Anglo-Saxon culture and the emerging literate culture associated with Christian monasticism. The gradual transition from oral to written literature occurring throughout Europe during the Viking Age accelerated in England, where the educational initiatives of Alfred the Great and his successors promoted literacy and the recording of oral traditions in written forms that enabled their preservation for modern study, while simultaneously transforming their character through the translation from oral performance to static text. The Old English poetry, preserved in manuscripts from the late Anglo-Saxon period, included works whose composition dated to the Viking Age, and which reflected contemporary experiences of Scandinavian attacks, settlement, and eventual integration, though the scarcity of precisely datable references and the conservative character of Old English poetic diction complicate efforts to distinguish Viking Age compositions from earlier works or later imitations of archaic forms. The Battle of Maldon, a fragmentary poem preserving descriptions of the battle fought in 991, when Ealdorman Byrhtnoth of Essex led English forces against Viking raiders near Maldon in Essex, represented one of the few Old English poems whose composition clearly dated to the Viking Age, and which treated contemporary events rather than legendary or historical subjects from earlier periods. The poem's emphasis on heroic ideals of loyalty, courage, and honor unto death, expressed through the speeches of Byrhtnoth's retainers, who chose to die fighting beside their slain lord rather than flee the battlefield, articulated values that transcended ethnic boundaries to express shared Germanic heroic culture that united Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian populations, despite their political antagonism. The Norse poetry and sagas preserved in medieval Icelandic manuscripts presented Scandinavian perspectives on Viking Age events in England and the broader Norse diaspora, though the late dates of manuscript compilation and the extensive temporal gap between described events and textual recording raised methodological challenges for historians, attempting to extract reliable historical information from aspersated literary sources shaped by centuries of oral transmission and conscious literary artistry. The King's sagas recounting the lives and reigns of Norwegian rulers, including Olaf Tryggvason and Olaf Haraldsson, included extensive descriptions of their activities in England during the late 10th and early 11th centuries, providing narratives of events also described in Anglo-Saxon sources, but from Scandinavian viewpoints that emphasized different actors and assigned distinct meanings to shared experiences. The convergence of Norse and English sources concerning major events, including battles, political negotiations, and dynastic marriages, enabled critical comparison that sometimes confirmed basic factual accuracy while revealing the cultural filtering through which each tradition interpreted events according to its particular values and interests. The skaldic poetry preserved in Norse manuscripts and attributed to named poets who composed their verses during the Viking Age provided sources whose historical value derived partly from their contemporary composition and the constraints of highly structured Old Norse poetic meters that resisted the casual alteration of verses during oral transmission. The skaldic poems, typically composed to honor kings and aristocratic patrons through praise poetry, recounting their military achievements and political successes, employed complex metaphorical language known as kennings, alongside intricate, alliterative, and syllabic patterns that made memorization necessary for performance, but simultaneously preserved wording through the difficulty of maintaining meter and alliteration if verses were altered significantly. The historical references embedded within skaldic verses, while typically brief and elusive, provided evidence about events and relationships that contemporary audiences would have understood through shared cultural knowledge, while modern scholars required extensive contextual information to interpret obscure references. The archaeological evidence for Viking Age literacy in England demonstrated that written communication extended beyond the Latin literacy of Christian clergy to include runic inscriptions employing the distinctive Scandinavian alphabet, whose simplified character set designed for carving on wood, stone, and metal provided Vikings with practical writing system suited to their material culture and communicative needs. The runic inscriptions found at sites throughout England, though relatively rare compared to the thousands of runic texts surviving from Scandinavia, documented the continued use of runic writing by Scandinavian settlers and their descendants for marking ownership, commemorating the dead, and recording brief messages whose laconic character reflected the writing system's primary functions as mnemonic device and status marker rather than vehicle for extended textual composition. The runic texts found in England ranged from ownership marks on portable objects, including bone combs and metal tools, to memorial stones commemorating deceased individuals through inscriptions that preserved names and occasional biographical details alongside Christian prayers, reflecting the religious syncretism of conversion period populations. The technological innovations attributed to Viking Age Scandinavia extended beyond the shipbuilding achievements that enabled their maritime expansion to include developments in metallurgy, textile production, and various craft traditions that demonstrated the sophistication of Viking Age material culture, despite the limited documentation of technical knowledge in contemporary written sources. The damascened sword blades produced by Scandinavian smiths through pattern welding techniques that created weapons combining hardness at the cutting edge with flexibility in the blade body to prevent brittle fracture under combat. Stress represented peak achievements of early medieval metallurgy, whose production required specialized knowledge, transmitted through craft traditions, jealously guarded by master smiths. The development of bloomery iron production techniques that achieved consistent quality in raw materials enabled the manufacture of large quantities of iron goods, supporting both military applications and the tools necessary for agricultural expansion and craft production. The archaeological evidence for specialized iron production sites in Scandinavia and at selected locations in England, demonstrated the organized character of iron manufacture during the Viking Age, with specialist producers concentrating on primary iron smelting, while urban craftsmen focused on working raw iron into finished products. The textile technologies employed in Viking Age England reflected the integration of Scandinavian practices with Anglo-Saxon traditions and the introduction of innovations that improved production efficiency or product quality. The vertical warp-weighted loom, typical of Scandinavian textile production, appeared in archaeological contexts throughout the Danelaw, distinguished by the numerous loom weights that tensioned warp threads and enabled the production of cloth whose width exceeded the horizontal looms inherited from Roman textile traditions. The archaeological evidence from loom weight distributions suggested that textile production occurred in both specialized workshops and household contexts, with prosperous urban households and rural farms maintaining textile production capacity to supply family needs, while professional textile workers concentrated in urban centers produced for commercial markets. The quality of preserved textile fragments, though necessarily biased toward contexts of exceptional preservation that protected organic materials from decay, demonstrated skilled craftsmanship, producing both utilitarian fabrics and decorative textiles, employing sophisticated weaving patterns and incorporating precious metal threads or expensive dyes that enhanced value and displayed wealth. The integration of Viking settlers into English social hierarchies occurred through processes of negotiation, conflict, and gradual accommodation that transformed both Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon populations, while creating hybrid Anglo-Scandinavian aristocracies whose members claimed mixed ancestry and participated in political, economic, and cultural systems drawing from both traditions. The creation of social bonds between populations through intermarriage connected Scandinavian and English families, while producing generations of mixed ancestry who claimed inheritance from both populations and maintained cultural practices drawn from multiple traditions. The political alliances negotiated between Viking leaders and English kings during the 10th century gradually incorporated Scandinavian aristocrats into English political structures as subordinate authorities who governed Danelaw territories on behalf of West Saxon overlords, while maintaining considerable local autonomy and preserving elements of Scandinavian political culture. The aristocratic culture of late Viking Age England synthesized Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon elements to produce distinctive forms of lordship, patronage, and social organization that characterized the political elite governing 10th and 11th century England, regardless of their ethnic origins. The military aristocracy that emerged from the Viking Age combined Scandinavian traditions of warrior leadership with Anglo-Saxon concepts of royal service and Christian ideals of divinely sanctioned authority to create political culture that valued martial prowess alongside administrative competence and religious patronage. The great aristocratic households that formed centers of political power, economic coordination, and cultural patronage throughout late Anglo-Saxon England maintained retinues of armed followers whose loyalty to their lords reflected both Germanic comitatus traditions, emphasizing personal bonds between warriors and chiefs. Feudal concepts of military service rewarded through land grants that created networks of obligation, extending across social hierarchies. The economic transformations accompanying and following Viking Age political developments created commercial economy characterized by market exchange, monetary circulation, and specialized production that distinguished late Anglo-Saxon England from earlier periods, when exchange occurred primarily through barter and wealth concentration, depended more on tribute extraction than commercial profit. The expansion of silver circulation, stemming initially from Viking raiding and trading activities, enabled the development of sophisticated monetary economy during the 10th century, as successive English kings standardized coinage, regulated minting, and enforced currency policies that facilitated commercial transactions while generating revenue for royal government through profits from currency production and periodic reminting requirements that created opportunities. Seigneurage. The urban development occurring throughout England during the 10th and 11th centuries, accelerated initially by Viking settlement and commercial expansion, but continuing under Anglo-Saxon political control, created networks of market towns that served both as local exchange centers, connecting agricultural producers with consumers, and as nodes in long-distance trading networks extending throughout northwestern Europe. The agricultural economy supporting Viking Age England depended on productive farming that combined arable cultivation with animal husbandry in mixed farming systems adapted to regional environmental conditions and market opportunities. The expansion of cultivated area through deforestation and wetland drainage increased agricultural production to support growing urban populations, while generating surpluses available for export through commercial networks. The archaeological evidence for improved agricultural tools, including iron plowshares and more efficient harvesting implements, suggested increasing investment in agricultural technology that raised productivity per unit of agricultural labor while enabling the cultivation of previously marginal lands. The systematic organization of agricultural landscapes through the development of open field systems that coordinated planting patterns and distributed land access among village populations created agricultural institutions that would persist through subsequent medieval centuries despite numerous political transformations. The legacy of Viking Age transformations extended beyond the immediate political, military, and settlement history to encompass fundamental restructuring of English society, economy, culture, and language that created preconditions for subsequent medieval developments, including the commercial expansion of the 11th through 13th centuries and the political consolidation that produced the English state familiar to later periods. The urbanization initiated during the Viking Age established networks of towns that formed the backbone of medieval English economic geography, while creating populations whose occupational specialization, commercial orientation, and distinctive urban culture differentiated them from rural agricultural majorities. The monetary economy that emerged from Viking Age commerce provided mechanisms for accumulation, exchange, and governmental financing that enabled the expansion of royal authority and the development of administrative institutions managing increasingly complex political, economic, and military systems. The cultural synthesis achieved through the merger of Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon populations created English culture that incorporated elements from both sources alongside Christian influences from continental Europe and insular traditions inherited from Celtic populations partially absorbed or displaced during earlier Germanic migrations to Britain. The impossibility of disentangling purely Scandinavian, Anglo-Saxon, or Christian elements from the hybrid culture of late Anglo-Saxon England testified to the thoroughness of cultural integration achieved through generations of interaction, conflict, and accommodation. The literature, art, law, language, and social institutions of 11th century England reflected contributions from all these sources without preserving clear boundaries between traditions that had merged to produce distinctive English culture that identified itself as English rather than Scandinavian or Anglo-Saxon despite consciousness of the diverse origins contributing to contemporary identity. The reassessment of Viking Age history within broader frameworks of migration, cultural contact, and empire building that characterized early medieval history throughout Europe and beyond challenged older narratives that isolated Viking activities as exceptional phenomena, disconnected from contemporary patterns of population, movement, and political transformation. The recognition of parallels between Viking expansion and other early medieval migrations, including Germanic movements into former Roman territories, Slavic expansion in Eastern Europe, and Arab conquests around the Mediterranean, situated Scandinavian activities within comparative contexts that revealed common patterns while respecting distinctive features. The integration of Viking Age history into histories of medieval Christianity that examined conversion processes, institutional development, and the expansion of Latin Christian culture throughout Northern Europe demonstrated how Scandinavian populations participated in transformations reshaping European civilization. Despite their late conversion and peripheral geographic location, the continued relevance of Viking Age history for understanding modern England, Scandinavia, and the broader North Atlantic world derives from the period's formative influence on political institutions, cultural practices, linguistic developments, and genetic compositions of populations whose contemporary identities incorporate Viking Age legacies, alongside numerous subsequent influences that continued shaping societies through subsequent centuries. The exploration of Viking Age history speaks to enduring interests in questions of identity, migration, cultural contact, and historical change that remain central to contemporary experience and self-understanding, despite the enormous temporal distance separating modern observers from Viking Age populations. The romantic fascination with Vikings that emerged during the 19th century and continues influencing popular culture through literature, film, and various media reflects both genuine historical interest and the projection of modern concerns onto conveniently distant historical subjects, whose complexity permits diverse interpretations, serving varied ideological and cultural purposes. The permanent Viking settlements that emerged during the late 9th and 10th centuries required more substantial fortifications than temporary military camps, leading to the development of defended urban centers and fortified aristocratic residences that combined military functionality with residential accommodation and administrative facilities. The excavations at York reveal traces of the defensive works that protected the Viking city during the 10th century, though the extensive subsequent occupation and continuous urban development complicated archaeological investigation of Viking Age fortifications. The documentary evidence suggested that York maintained substantial defenses, including earthworks and timber palisades, reinforced during periods of military threat, while the relative security of Viking political control during extended periods permitted the development of extensive, undefended suburbs outside the fortified core, where commercial and industrial activities expanded beyond the restricted space available within defensive perimeters. The tension between military security requiring concentrated populations within defended areas and economic efficiency, favoring dispersed settlement patterns across landscapes, productive for agriculture or convenient for commerce, shaped settlement development throughout the Viking Age. The relationship between fortification, construction, and political authority became particularly apparent during the 10th century, as successive English kings, extending their control over formerly Viking territories, established new, fortified towns or reinforced existing defensive works to secure conquered regions, while simultaneously creating infrastructure supporting commercial development and administrative governance. The fortified towns established under English royal authority in reconquered Danelaw territories served multiple overlapping functions, including military garrisons, protecting against Viking resurgence or external attack, administrative centers for royal officials collecting taxes and enforcing royal authority, market towns where agricultural producers and urban craftsmen exchanged goods under conditions of security that royal protection provided, and symbolic assertions of royal power manifested through impressive defensive works and urban planning demonstrating organized authority. The systematic program of fortified town construction undertaken by Edward the Elder and his successors during the early 10th century created a network of mutually supporting strongpoints that enabled English forces to respond rapidly to military threats while simultaneously establishing territorial control that survived transitions between reigns and provided framework for subsequent administrative development. The military technology employed during the Viking Age encompassed weapons, armor, and tactical systems whose sophistication matched or exceeded contemporary military practices throughout Europe, despite the reputation for primitive ferocity that medieval Christian writers attributed to pagan Scandinavian raiders. The swords carried by elite Viking warriors represented the pinnacle of early medieval metallurgical achievement through their pattern-welded construction that combined different iron alloys to produce blades maintaining sharp cutting edges while resisting the brittle fracture that afflicted inferior weapons produced from single types of iron with properties unsuited to weapon manufacture. The production of high-quality swords required specialized knowledge of ironworking that master smiths guarded jealously, while commanding prices that restricted sword ownership to aristocratic warriors, whose wealth permitted investment in premium weaponry. The named swords that appear frequently in Norse sagas reflected both the substantial economic value of quality weapons and the symbolic significance of swords as markers of social status and military identity. The archaeological evidence from weapon burials throughout the Viking Age demonstrated that while swords remained restricted to wealthy warriors, the spear served as the universal weapon of Scandinavian military forces, with examples found in graves across the social spectrum, from aristocratic burials furnished with multiple weapons to more modest graves containing single spears as the only military equipment accompanying the deceased. The body armor available to Viking Age warriors included chainmail shirts, constructed from thousands of individually forged and linked iron rings, whose manufacture required enormous labor investment that restricted ownership to wealthy elites. The chainmail armor, known as burnie, provided flexible protection, covering the torso and sometimes extending to protect upper arms and thighs, depending on the garment's size and the wearer's wealth. The effectiveness of chainmail against cutting attacks from swords and axes made it highly desirable despite its substantial weight and cost, leading to the development of armor-piercing weapons, including specialized spear points and arrows designed to penetrate between mail rings. The layers of padded textile worn beneath metal armor provided essential cushioning, absorbing impact forces that chainmail alone could not fully dissipate, while also preventing the uncomfortable direct contact between metal armor and skin during extended wear. The limited archaeological survival of organic textile padding means that contemporary knowledge of this essential component of Viking Age military equipment depends primarily on later medieval sources and inference from what physical comfort would have required, rather than direct evidence from Viking Age contexts. The archaeological evidence for religious transformation included the gradual shift from pagan burial practices, including cremation and furnished inhumation, to Christian burial rites, whose distinctive characteristics enabled identification of converted populations, even when documentary evidence of religious affiliation remained absent. The timing of burial practice changes varied considerably across the Danelaw regions, with some areas showing rapid adoption of Christian burial by the early 10th century, while other regions preserved pagan burial customs into the mid-10th century despite nominal conversion. The presence of Christian religious objects, including crosses and devotional items, in graves that otherwise followed pagan burial customs, with substantial grave goods and non-Christian orientation, suggested transitional populations, maintaining elements of both religious traditions. The eventual elimination of furnished burial and the universal adoption of Christian cemetery practices marked completion of conversion processes that required multiple generations to achieve full cultural transformation from pagan, Christian religious identity. The settlement of Scandinavian populations in England created economic transformations through the introduction of agricultural labor, commercial expertise, and manufacturing skills alongside the consumption demands of immigrant populations requiring food, housing, clothing, tools, and various goods and services, whose production employed English and Scandinavian workers in expanding economic activities. The clearing of previously unfarmed land by Scandinavian settlers expanded the total agricultural production of regions receiving Viking colonization, while the establishment of new market towns and the expansion of existing urban centers created opportunities for commercial exchange and craft production. The integration of England into broader North Sea and Baltic trading networks through Scandinavian merchant activity connected English producers to distant markets while simultaneously making foreign goods available to English consumers, whose purchasing power increased during periods of economic expansion. The long-term economic benefits of Viking Age commercial expansion outweighed the immediate costs of military conflict and tribute payment, though the distribution of costs and benefits varied dramatically across social groups, with wealthy landowners bearing much of the tribute burden, while urban craftsmen and merchants gained from commercial expansion. The continued evolution of Viking Age scholarship promises further refinement of understanding as new evidence emerges from archaeological excavations, scientific analyses, and innovative interpretations of existing documentary sources. The application of emerging technologies, including advanced DNA analysis, isotopic studies of human and animal remains, increasingly sophisticated dating methods, and computer modeling of historical processes, enables research questions and analytical approaches impossible for earlier generations of scholars. The international collaboration connecting researchers across modern national boundaries that would have been incomprehensible to Viking Age populations creates opportunities for comparative analysis and data sharing that enriches understanding of the period as interconnected phenomenon, affecting multiple regions simultaneously through population movements, commercial exchanges, and cultural transmissions that transcended political divisions. The democratization of archaeological knowledge through digital archives, online databases, and public engagement initiatives makes Viking Age research accessible to broader audiences, while simultaneously creating new responsibilities for scholars to communicate complex findings without oversimplification or sensationalism. The environmental context of Viking Age England encompassed climatic conditions, ecological systems, and natural resources whose characteristics shaped agricultural possibilities, settlement patterns, and economic opportunities available to both Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian populations, whose survival depended ultimately on their capacity to extract sustenance from landscapes whose productivity determined the carrying capacity of human populations. The climate of the Viking Age corresponded to what paleoclimatologists designate the medieval warm period, a phase of relatively mild temperatures in the North Atlantic region that facilitated agricultural expansion in marginal areas, including the northern British Isles, Iceland, and eventually Greenland, where Norse settlers established farms that would become untenable during the subsequent climatic deterioration of the Little Ice Age. The warmer temperatures characteristic of the Viking Age enabled cultivation of cereals at higher elevations and latitudes than possible during colder periods, while simultaneously extending growing seasons that increased agricultural productivity in regions already under cultivation. The climatic advantages of the medieval warm period contributed to population growth throughout Europe that created demographic pressure, driving emigration from regions where land scarcity limited opportunities for younger sons of farming, families whose inheritance prospects diminished as population density increased. The fishery resources available in rivers, estuaries, and coastal waters provided essential protein sources, supplementing agricultural production while creating commercial opportunities for populations with access to productive fishing grounds and markets where preserved fish found ready purchasers. The fish weirs constructed in rivers throughout England to facilitate fish capture through the placement of barriers, funneling fish into traps, demonstrated the systematic exploitation of aquatic resources through infrastructure requiring substantial labor investment, but providing reliable returns across fishing seasons. The preservation of fish through drying, salting, or smoking enabled storage and transportation, extending the availability of fish protein beyond the immediate catch, while creating valuable trade commodities whose concentration of nutrition in preserved forms made them economically viable. For long-distance trade, despite substantial transportation costs, the herring fisheries of the North Sea and the cod fisheries of the Northern Atlantic, that would become enormously important in later medieval trade, had origins traceable to Viking Age development of maritime commercial networks, preservation technologies, enabling fish to become major trade commodities. The salt production essential for food preservation and dietary requirements occurred at coastal salt working sites, where the evaporation of seawater in shallow pans yielded salt that inland populations obtained through purchase or fand, barter. The inland salt springs, including those at Droitwich in Worcestershire, where natural brine sources permitted salt production without access to seawater, created valuable resource concentrations that supported specialized production serving regional markets where salt commanded prices, justified by its necessity for preserving meat and fish that would otherwise spoil. The technological requirements of effective salt production, including the fuel sources needed to evaporate water from brine, the ceramic or metal containers used in evaporation processes, and the expertise required to achieve optimal yields, created barriers to entry that limited competition, while enabling successful salt producers to accumulate wealth through the systematic provision of essential commodity to populations lacking local production capacity. The transportation infrastructure of Viking Age England encompassed the road networks inherited from Roman Britain, whose deterioration during the Anglo-Saxon period had reduced but not eliminated their utility for land. Transportation. The river systems that provided natural transportation corridors, enabling bulk cargo movement, impossible overland. and the coastal shipping that connected ports and permitted maritime commerce, less expensive per unit weight than land transportation, despite the risks of storms and piracy. The Roman roads, whose construction standards had created durable routes connecting major urban centers, remained partially usable throughout the Anglo-Saxon period, despite the absence of systematic maintenance that allowed surface deterioration and the encroachment of vegetation that gradually obscured routes in regions of light use. The political fragmentation characterizing early Anglo-Saxon England reduced incentives for road maintenance, as the benefits of improved transportation often accrued to rival kingdoms, while maintenance costs fell upon populations, controlling particular road segments. The unification of England under West Saxon rule during the 10th century created opportunities for more systematic approach to transportation infrastructure, whose coordination across political boundaries became feasible once those boundaries' significance decreased through political consolidation. The urbanization processes that transformed Viking Age England from predominantly rural society to one incorporating substantial urban populations residing in specialized settlement forms, characterized by high population density, occupational diversity, and economic dependence on commercial exchange rather than direct agricultural production, created social environments fostering innovation, cultural transmission, and the development of distinctive urban cultures, differentiating city dwellers from rural majorities. The urban populations of Viking Age England, while remaining small relative to total population, with perhaps 5 to 10% of inhabitants residing in settlements classifiable as towns or cities, exercised influence disproportionate to their numbers through their concentration of wealth, their control of commercial networks, their literacy and administrative expertise, and their cultural sophistication derived from exposure to diverse influences converging in urban environments. The social tensions between urban and rural populations, whose economic interests sometimes conflicted, and whose cultural practices diverged, created divisions within societies that legal systems and political authorities struggled to manage. Through institutions accommodating different circumstances of urban merchants and rural farmers, whose situations demanded distinct regulatory approaches, the legal systems governing Viking Age England reflected the plural character of society, encompassing multiple ethnic groups, different regional traditions, and varying social statuses, whose interactions required complex regulatory frameworks defining rights, obligations, and procedures for resolving disputes. The preservation of distinctive Danelaw legal traditions, alongside the West Saxon laws that increasingly claimed universal application throughout unified England, created legal pluralism that lasted well beyond the end of Scandinavian. Political control, as regional legal variations persisted through custom and precedent, even after nominal unification under common royal authority. The compilation of law codes by successive English kings, beginning with Alfred and continuing through Ethelstan, Edmund, Edgar, and later monarchs, demonstrated royal efforts to assert authority through legislative activity, while simultaneously documenting customary practices that kings recognized rather than invented. The gap between promulgated law codes and actual legal practice that characterizes most societies appeared particularly pronounced in Viking Age England, where the weak enforcement capacity of royal government permitted substantial local variation in legal procedures and substantive rules that written codes could prescribe but not effectively impose upon communities, maintaining alternative practices through custom. The intellectual culture of Viking Age England combined Anglo-Saxon Christian learning inherited from earlier centuries with Scandinavian oral traditions, and the limited but significant influence of continental scholarship transmitted through ecclesiastical connections and the mobility of learned individuals. The educational institutions centered on monasteries and cathedrals that had suffered extensive disruption during the initial Viking attacks recovered during the late 9th and 10th centuries through the patronage of kings, including Alfred, who prioritized educational reform and the restoration of learning as essential components of Christian rulership. The translation movement, initiated under Alfred's sponsorship, produced Old English versions of Latin texts deemed essential for Christian education and moral formation, making classical and patristic learning accessible to audiences lacking Latin literacy. while simultaneously demonstrating the viability of vernacular English as medium for sophisticated intellectual discourse. The manuscript production that accelerated during the 10th century as monastic scriptoria recovered from Viking disruption created books whose decoration synthesized Anglo-Saxon, Scandinavian, and continental influences into distinctive, insular artistic style that would influence manuscript illumination throughout medieval Europe. The artistic achievements of Viking Age England encompassed architectural monuments, metalwork, sculpture, manuscript illumination, and various decorative arts whose surviving examples demonstrated high levels of technical skill and aesthetic sophistication despite the limited resources of societies where artistic patronage competed with military expenses and other claims on elite wealth. The church architecture of the late Anglo-Saxon period developed distinctive forms characterized by tall, narrow proportions, decorative pilaster strips, articulating wall surfaces, and long and short work quoin construction, whose technical and aesthetic characteristics distinguished English church building from contemporary continental architecture. The metalwork produced for ecclesiastical and secular purposes demonstrated mastery of casting, engraving, and decorative techniques including cloisonné enamel, niello inlay, and gilding that enriched surfaces while displaying patron wealth. The sculpture, in stone, that adorned churches, commemorated the dead, and marked locations of religious or political significance, developed artistic programs, combining figural representation with decorative patterns, synthesizing Mediterranean, insular, and Scandinavian influences into visual vocabularies expressing complex meanings through iconographic associations that contemporary audiences understood through shared cultural knowledge. The demographic patterns of Viking Age England, including population size, growth rates, settlement densities, and the distribution of population between urban and rural locations, remain subject to substantial uncertainty due to the absence of census data or systematic population records from the period, forcing modern scholars to rely on indirect evidence, including the number and size of settlements identified through archaeological survey, the carrying capacity of agricultural systems whose productivity can be estimated from environmental and technological evidence, and backward projection from later medieval population figures whose relationship to earlier periods requires assumptions about growth rates and mortality patterns. The population of England during the Viking Age likely numbered between 1 and 2 million inhabitants, distributed unevenly across regions, with concentrations in agriculturally productive lowland areas and relatively sparse settlement in upland regions where environmental limitations restricted farming. The population growth occurring during the late Anglo-Saxon period contributed to economic expansion, urbanization, and political consolidation through the creation of larger labor forces, expanded consumer demand, and increased military manpower, whose deployment in defensive systems and expansionist warfare enabled territorial consolidation. The family structures and kinship systems organizing social relationships in Viking Age England encompassed the nuclear families, consisting of parents and their offspring, who typically resided together in single households alongside extended kin networks that provided social insurance, political alliances, and the transmission of property across generations through inheritance practices, favoring male heirs while providing some security for widows and daughters. The marriage patterns establishing family units reflected both the economic considerations requiring unions between families of comparable status and the effective bonds whose importance varied across social groups and historical periods. The aristocratic marriages that created political alliances between elite families balanced personal preferences against familial interests, as parents arranged unions consolidating wealth, creating military alliances, or resolving conflicts through the establishment of kinship connections. The regulation of marriage by Christian church authorities sought to impose ecclesiastical marriage law, prohibiting divorce, requiring monogamy, and defining prohibited degrees of relationship within which marriage constituted incest, though enforcement of these regulations faced challenges from populations maintaining alternative practices rooted in pre-Christian traditions. The final consolidation of English political unity during the 10th century created administrative structures, institutional precedents, and ideological frameworks that shaped subsequent English political development, even as successive waves of invasion, conquest, and internal transformation repeatedly disrupted continuities, while never entirely erasing institutional memories and precedents established during earlier periods. The ideal of unified English kingdom under single Christian monarch, achieved during the mid-10th century, survived challenges, including the Danish conquest of the early 11th century and the Norman conquest of 1066, demonstrating the resilience of political concepts once established, even when specific dynasties fell and foreign rulers claimed English thrones. The institutional developments, including royal administration, legal systems, monetary regulation, and ecclesiastical organization that matured during late Anglo-Saxon England, provided foundations on which Norman and later Plantagenet governance built, creating continuities that connected Viking Age innovations to the medieval and early modern English state, whose development proceeded through transformation rather than complete replacement of inherited institutions. The memory of Viking Age events, preserved in chronicles, in place names, in genetic heritage, and in cultural practices continuing long after the end of Scandinavian political control, demonstrated the lasting impact of historical developments, whose consequences extended across centuries to influence populations separated from Viking Age actors by numerous generations, yet connected through chains of transmission, whose links remained unbroken despite the transformations of intervening periods.